Come close now, dear soul, you whose tired heart has carried you through another day that seemed to ask more of your spirit than you felt capable of giving. I see you there in whatever quiet corner of the world has become your refuge this evening, perhaps feeling the accumulated weight of responsibilities that pressed against your shoulders like an invisible burden. Perhaps wondering if there exists anywhere in this vast universe a place where true rest is possible for hearts that have forgotten what peace feels like when it settles into the deepest chambers of human longing. Welcome, my cherished friend, to this sacred sanctuary we have prepared together, this gentle harbor where the relentless demands of daily existence cannot reach and where stillness spreads around your weary form like the softest covering woven from moonbeams and divine tenderness. You have traveled far today, haven't you? Navigating the choppy waters of obligations that seem to multiply faster than your strength to meet them. Dodging the sharp words of those who speak without thinking of the tender places in human hearts. Carrying concerns that were never meant to be borne by mortal hands alone, but which somehow found their way onto your back because you are the kind of person who cannot turn away from suffering. Who cannot ignore the cries of those in need, even when your own reserves have been drained to their very depths. Your compassion has cost you dearly today, as it always does, leaving you feeling simultaneously emptied and strangely filled, exhausted yet somehow energized by the knowledge that love flowed through you into spaces where darkness had taken residence and convinced souls they would never again see light break through the clouds that had gathered around their hopes. Take this moment now to simply notice where you are, to feel the blessed relief of setting down that invisible pack you have been carrying, allowing your body to remember what it means to be supported completely without having to earn that support through effort or achievement or any form of striving that has become so habitual you barely recognize how it exhausts every muscle and nerve. The surface that holds you now, whether it be the familiar comfort of your own bed, where you have wrestled with countless concerns, or a chair that has become your evening retreat, receives you with the unconditional acceptance that your soul has been craving. Throughout all the hours that have passed since you last allowed yourself this kind of complete surrender to rest. Let us breathe together now, you and I, sharing these moments of conscious connection with the gift of life itself that flows through your lungs without your permission or effort. This miraculous process that has sustained you through every trial of this day and will continue sustaining you through whatever challenges tomorrow may bring to test your faith and stretch your capacity for trust and purposes larger than your individual understanding. Draw in slowly and deeply through your nose, feeling your chest expand not just with air but with possibility, with hope, with the whispered promise that rest is not only possible but is your divine birthright as a beloved child of the one who created you for joy rather than endless struggle, for peace rather than perpetual anxiety, for love rather than the fear that masquerades as responsibility, but is really just another form of the worry that keeps hearts racing when they should be resting in perfect confidence. Hold this breath gently, not with the tension that has defined so much of your day, but with the tender care you might use to cradle a sleeping infant, recognizing that the air filling your lungs carries more than oxygen into your being. Feel how your ribs expand outward like doors opening to welcome long-awaited guests, how your diaphragm descends like a blessing, settling into the deepest places of your spirit, how even this simple act of breathing becomes a prayer when offered with conscious gratitude to the source from which all breath comes and to which all breath returns in the eternal rhythm of giving and receiving that governs all existence. Now release this breath slowly through slightly parted lips, breathing out not just carbon dioxide, but every accumulated frustration of the day just past, every disappointment that clung to your spirit like dust on a traveler's garment, every moment of confusion or anger or sadness that found its way into the sacred chambers of your heart and attempted to make itself at home as if it belonged there. Let it all flow out of you now on this breath, like water flowing downstream toward the ocean, carrying away the debris of difficult hours and leaving behind only the clear essence of who you truly are beneath all the roles you play and all the masks you wear to protect yourself from a world that often seems too harsh for hearts as tender as yours. Again now, breathing in peace that surpasses understanding, breathing in the deep assurance that this moment belongs entirely to you and to the love that has been seeking you all day through every trial and tribulation, following you through every maze of worry and concern, waiting patiently for you to pause long enough to recognize the presence that never leaves and never forsakes. Your lungs are filling now, not just with air, but with recognition that you are held by arms that never grow tired of holding, supported by love that never questions your worthiness to receive it, surrounded by grace that sees not what you have done or failed to do, but who you are becoming through every struggle and every surrender. Hold it gently, this gift of breath that comes without cost or condition, and feel how it connects you to every living thing that shares this planet with you, every tree that exhales the oxygen you inhale, every person whose lungs fill and empty in the same ancient rhythm that has sustained life since the first breath was drawn in paradise where all stories began. You are part of something vast and beautiful and eternal, something that began before time and will continue after time has served its purpose and been folded up like a garment that is no longer needed because winter has given way to eternal spring, where tears are wiped away and every sorrow is transformed into joy too deep for words to contain. Now breathe out again, releasing not just the air that has served its purpose, but every weight you have been carrying that was never meant to be yours, every burden you picked up along the way because someone dropped it and you could not bear to see it lying there unclaimed. Every responsibility that attached itself to you like a lost child seeking comfort. Feel now how your breathing has begun to slow and deepen without any effort on your part, finding its own perfect rhythm like waves finding their eternal pace against shores that have welcomed them for countless ages, like your heart settling into the steady beat of someone who knows they are completely safe, completely loved, completely accepted exactly as they are in this moment, without needing to change anything about themselves to earn the comfort that is being offered as freely as sunlight, as generously as rain, as constantly as the love that holds every atom in the universe in perfect harmony. You are not alone in this peaceful gathering tonight, my dearest companion on this journey toward rest that your weary soul has been seeking through all the noise and chaos of days that have demanded more than seemed humanly possible. All across our sleeping world, other souls like yours have found their way to the same place of refuge, other weary hearts seeking the same comfort you are discovering, other spirits who understand what it means to feel overwhelmed by the sheer complexity of existence in times that seem designed to fragment attention and fracture peace. Some who join us tonight have been walking paths of contemplation for many years, their hearts seasoned by countless encounters with grace that has proven itself faithful through seasons of abundance and seasons of scarcity, through times of clarity and times of confusion that tested their faith, but never broke their fundamental trust in love that remains constant when everything else changes. Others may be newer to this kind of spiritual seeking, their hearts cautiously opening to possibilities they may have dismissed before as irrelevant to practical concerns of daily life, drawn by hungers they can barely name but cannot ignore. Whether you arrive here as a seasoned pilgrim, whose feet are familiar with these ancient pathways, or as a curious newcomer taking tentative first steps into territories that feel both foreign and mysteriously familiar, you are equally welcome in this community of hearts that recognize their need for something beyond what the visible world can provide. The very fact that you have chosen to spend these precious evening hours in contemplation of eternal things, rather than consuming entertainment that demands nothing in returns, nothing speaks to something beautiful awakening within your spirit. Tonight we are about to embark together on a journey that will transport us across centuries, to walk alongside the most extraordinary person who has ever drawn breath upon this earth, to witness love in its purest form as it moved through our world in human flesh, touching lives and transforming hearts in ways that continue to ripple through time like stones dropped into still water. We will not observe these sacred events from academic distance, but will experience them as beloved friends, allowing our hearts to be opened by the same love that opened the hearts of fishermen and tax collectors, of anyone who encountered this remarkable man whose presence changed everything it touched. Feel yourself beginning to release your hold on the familiar landmarks of your contemporary world, the digital devices that slice time into manageable pieces, the electric lights that banish natural darkness, and the rhythms it brings to human hearts that have learned to live by artificial schedules rather than ancient patterns written into creation itself. The constant hum of machinery that has become the soundtrack to modern life is fading now, becoming distant and unimportant as we prepare to step backward through time into an era when people measured their days by the sun's journey across the sky rather than the relentless ticking of clocks. Chapter 2: Journey into Sacred Lands. The transformation begins as gently as dawn breaking over hills that have witnessed countless sunrises, as naturally as flowers opening their petals to light that has traveled unimaginable distances through space to kiss their faces with warmth that speaks of love beyond human comprehension. Feel the ground beneath your feet changing from the processed surfaces of contemporary life to textures that connect you directly with Earth itself. Paths worn smooth by generations of pilgrims who walked these same routes, carrying prayers in their hearts and hope in their steps. Merchants whose caravans moved slowly but steadily between distant cities. Shepherds whose patient care for their woolly charges taught them lessons about divine love that no classroom could provide. This is Palestine as it existed 20 centuries ago, a land bridge between great civilizations where cultures met and mingled, where the ancient and eternal intersected with the temporal and immediate, in ways that prepared the perfect stage for the greatest drama ever enacted upon the theater of human history. The air you are breathing now carries scents that have been lost to most modern experience. The clean sweetness of wild honey mixed with the earthy richness of bread baked in outdoor ovens by women whose hands have learned the sacred art of transforming grain into sustenance, whose hearts understand that feeding others is one of the purest expressions of love that human beings can offer to one another. The sky above you stretches in a dome of blue so perfect, it seems painted by divine fingers that took infinite care to create exactly the right backdrop for the story about to unfold beneath its vast expanse. Clouds drift across this celestial canvas like thoughts across the mind of the Creator, some heavy with rain that will water the crops growing in terraced fields, carved into hillsides by farmers who understand their partnership with heaven begins with respect for the soil that receives their seeds and ends with gratitude for harvests that feed families through another winter. Rolling hills covered with olive groves stretch toward horizons painted in colors that no earthly artist has ever managed to capture completely. Trees whose twisted trunks speak of patience and endurance that comes from roots that go deep into soil that has nurtured life for thousands of years, whose silver-green leaves catch light in ways that transform ordinary moments into glimpses of glory, whose fruit will be pressed into oil that illuminates homes and anoints heads and carries prayers upward on smoke that rises from altars where gratitude is offered in forms as old as human memory. These groves have stood for centuries, planted by ancestors for descendants they would never meet, tended by hands that understood their work as stewardship of gifts too precious to squander, too beautiful to exploit, too sacred to treat as mere commodities to be bought and sold in marketplaces that know the price of everything but the value of nothing that truly matters to hearts, created for relationship with their Maker, scattered across. These ancient hills are villages built from stones that came from the very ground on which they stand, communities that seem to grow naturally from the landscape rather than imposing themselves upon it, like conquering armies claiming territory through force. The houses are simple but sturdy, designed by people who understood that the purpose of shelter is to protect what matters most. The human hearts that gather around fires to share stories that connect children to their heritage, and bind families together across generations with invisible threads stronger than iron, more enduring than monuments carved from marble by hands, seeking to be remembered long after their owners have returned to dust. Windows are small but welcoming, designed to frame views of beauty rather than display wealth, to invite morning light while preserving evening privacy, to serve practical needs while honoring aesthetic sensibilities that recognize beauty as necessary for human flourishing as food or water or air. Doors are generous in their proportions, built to accommodate not just the passage of bodies, but the flow of hospitality that characterizes communities where neighbors are family and strangers are guests, sent by Providence to test the sincerity of love claimed in prayers, but proven in practical service to anyone whose need provides opportunity for grace to be demonstrated through human hands and hearts. Rooftops serve as gathering places where families come to catch evening breezes and watch the sun paint the western sky in shades of rose and gold and purple that speak of divine artistry too magnificent for human duplication. The air carries fragrances that modern noses have never experienced, but ancient hearts remember as the scent of home, of belonging, of places where love makes its dwelling regardless of architectural grandeur or material wealth. Wild herbs grow along forgotten paths where children gather ingredients for mothers, whose cooking transforms simple materials into meals that nourish more than bodies, that feed souls hungry for the comfort that comes only when food is prepared by hands that understand nourishment as sacred offering of love, made tangible in forms that can be tasted and shared and remembered long after stomachs are full. Mixed with these herbal perfumes is the warmer scent of wool from sheep that graze on hills carpeted with grass and wildflowers, animals whose simple contentment under the watchful eyes of shepherds who know each one by name speaks of security that comes not from insurance policies or investment portfolios, but from relationship with those whose love makes protection not just a duty but a joy. The subtle fragrance of precious spices drifts on evening breezes, speaking of prayers offered with materials that cost their offerers real sacrifice, but were given gladly because worship that costs nothing teaches hearts nothing about the value of what they claim to treasure above all else. Water moves through this landscape in streams that follow courses carved by divine intention rather than human engineering, pooling in natural basins where sheep can drink and women can draw the precious liquid that sustains all life, creating music as it flows over stones polished smooth by centuries of current that speaks of persistence and patience, of steady progress toward destinations known only to the one who set these waters in motion and guides their journey toward seas that receive all rivers with equal welcome regardless of their size or source, or the length of their journey from mountain springs to ocean depths. Listen carefully and you can hear other sounds beginning to penetrate your consciousness as your heart attunes itself to frequencies that modern ears have forgotten how to perceive. The lowing of cattle as they are led to water in the evening coolness, their deep voices speaking of contentment that comes from lives lived according to natural rhythms rather than artificial schedules, of needs met by provision they did not create and could not sustain but receive with simple trust that teaches human hearts lessons about faith they can learn in no other way. Children's voices rise and fall in games that require nothing more than imagination and the simple joy of being alive in a world full of wonders too numerous to count, too beautiful to fully appreciate, too generous to comprehend except through hearts that have not yet learned to doubt that every good gift comes from above, that every moment of happiness is grace, that every breath drawn and released is participation in mystery so profound that wise men spend lifetimes trying to understand. What children know instinctively from the moment they first open eyes that see not just light and shadow, but love made visible. Chapter 3. The man from Nazareth in the small hillside town of Nazareth, nestled among the rolling hills of Galilee like a precious jewel set in a crown of natural splendor that speaks of divine artistry in every stone and tree and blade of grass that grows there, There lived a young man whose very presence seemed to alter the atmosphere around him in ways that people noticed without being able to explain, whose ordinary appearance masked mysteries that would soon transform not only individual lives, but the entire course of human history itself. His name was Yeshua, though the world would come to know him by the Greek form Jesus, and while his hands bore the calluses of honest labor, earned through years of working with wood and stone under the patient guidance of his earthly father, while his face carried the warm bronze of Mediterranean sun, and his eyes reflected depths that seemed to contain both earth and heaven, there was something in his presence that made even casual observers pause and wonder. He had grown up walking these same narrow streets where children still play the same games their ancestors played 1,000 years before, learning his first lessons about human nature and divine love from parents whose extraordinary faithfulness had already marked them as different in a community where faithfulness was not rare, but where their particular quality of surrender to divine will created ripples that touched every life that came into contact with their humble household. Joseph, the village carpenter whose workshop echoed with sounds of creation and restoration, had taught his adopted son that broken things could always be mended with sufficient patience and skill, that raw materials possessed potential that could only be realized through careful attention and persistent love applied day after day until what had been merely functional became beautiful. Mary, whose heart had been stretched wide enough to contain mysteries that would have crushed lesser souls, had demonstrated through every word and action what it meant to trust completely in purposes larger than human understanding, to say yes to plans that challenged every conventional expectation about how divine power operates in human affairs, to carry with grace secrets too wonderful to share, yet too powerful to hide completely. Her quiet strength and unshakable peace had provided the stable foundation from which her extraordinary son would launch a ministry that would reach every corner of the earth and extend through every generation until time itself gives way to eternity. The workshop where Jesus had spent countless hours learning the ancient craft that connected him to generations of men who understood their work as partnership with the creative force that formed the world from nothing, was filled with fragrances and textures that would forever remind him of lessons learned not through books or lectures, but through patient repetition of tasks that taught his hands to serve, his mind to solve problems, his heart to take satisfaction in work, well done for its own sake rather than for any recognition it might bring. Here among wood shavings that curled like prayers rising toward heaven, among tools worn smooth by generations of craftsmen, among projects that would serve families for decades to come, Jesus absorbed understanding that would later flower into parables about building on foundations solid enough to withstand storms. But even as a boy whose questions during synagogue discussions revealed understanding that amazed learned men accustomed to children who fidgeted during long readings, there had been something that set Jesus apart from his companions in ways that only became clear to those who looked back years later with the gift of hindsight, illuminated by events that would demonstrate conclusively who this carpenter's son really was beneath the humble exterior that concealed glories too bright for human eyes to behold directly. Village elders remembered conversations that carried weight beyond their simple words, discussions that revealed layers of meaning they had never suspected existed in familiar texts they thought they understood completely after decades of study. His questions penetrated to hearts of matters that had puzzled rabbis for generations, cutting through centuries of commentary and debate to expose truths so simple that children could grasp them, yet so profound that scholars would spend lifetimes exploring depths they had glimpsed in moments of clarity, granted by grace rather than earned through effort. When Jesus listened to ancient stories in the synagogue where his ancestors had gathered for centuries to remember their identity as chosen people, his attention was so complete and his insights so penetrating that grown men found themselves seeing familiar narratives with fresh eyes, discovering connections they had never noticed, understanding implications that had remained hidden until illuminated by observations that seemed to come from someone who had been present when these events originally occurred. The religious authorities of his day, men who had dedicated their entire lives to memorizing intricate details of scriptural law and commentary that had grown like layers of sediment around the original texts, would eventually struggle to categorize this carpenter who spoke with authority they could not match despite their impressive credentials and institutional positions that normally commanded automatic respect from ordinary people. These learned men inhabited a religious world that had become complicated beyond recognition, layered with rules and regulations that often seemed designed more to exclude than include, to burden rather than bless, to create hierarchies of worthiness that separated the supposedly righteous from the obviously sinful, rather than revealing divine love that embraces all humanity without distinction. Jesus had grown up observing how ordinary people struggled under spiritual weights they were never meant to carry alone, watching how light faded from eyes that had once sparkled with hope when souls felt disconnected from the God they longed to know and serve, but could not seem to please no matter how hard they tried to follow rules that multiplied faster than human ability to remember them all. He witnessed shoulders sagging beneath burdens that religious authorities kept adding rather than lifting, observed hearts growing cold under the weight of expectations that crushed rather than inspired, saw spirits withering under judgment that condemned rather than redeemed. Yet there was something in Jesus that remained undimmed by the spiritual darkness he observed around him, a light that seemed to grow brighter, rather than dimmer when confronted with human confusion and pain, and the systematic attempts to obscure divine truth beneath human tradition that served institutional interests more than divine purposes or human needs, crying out for compassionate response. In Joseph's workshop, surrounded by broken furniture waiting to be restored and raw wood waiting to be shaped into useful forms, he had learned that redemption was always possible, that what seemed ruined beyond repair could be made beautiful again, through patient application of skill and care and love that refused to give up on anything created by divine hands. The political atmosphere of his time was thick with tension and uncertainty that affected every aspect of daily life in ways both obvious and subtle, creating an environment where hope was dangerous and trust was rare, because those who dared to believe in better possibilities often found themselves crushed beneath systems designed to maintain control rather than promote human flourishing. Roman soldiers marched through Jewish streets with confident arrogance of occupying forces, their presence a constant reminder that this promised land was currently under foreign control, their demands for taxes and compliance leaving families struggling to maintain both their physical survival and their spiritual integrity in circumstances that seemed designed to test faith beyond reasonable limits. Into this world of political oppression and religious confusion, Jesus would soon step with a message so simple it seemed naive to sophisticated minds, yet so radical it would turn the established order upside down in the most wonderful way possible. He would demonstrate that the kingdom of heaven advances not through violence or political maneuvering, not through religious debate or philosophical argument, but through the revolutionary power of unconditional love expressed in practical service to anyone who needed healing, hope, or simply the assurance that they mattered to someone who would never abandon them regardless of their past mistakes or present circumstances that might make others turn away in disgust or disappointment. Chapter 4. The beginning of something sacred. The morning sun was painting the eastern sky in watercolors of coral and amber when Jesus made his way through terrain that grew progressively more wild and rocky as he approached the banks of the Jordan River, where crowds had been gathering for weeks to hear the powerful proclamations of a desert prophet, whose message of preparation and transformation had stirred hearts throughout Palestine and beyond its borders, drawing people from every level of society who sensed that something unprecedented was stirring in the spiritual atmosphere of their time, something that demanded response deeper than curiosity or intellectual interest but required the kind of heart change that could only come from genuine encounter with divine truth spoken by someone who had learned to distinguish the voice of the Almighty from all the other voices competing for human attention. This was John, called the Baptist, who had grown up in wilderness places far from the comfortable compromises of city life, sustained by locusts and wild honey that spoke of complete dependence upon divine provision rather than human planning. Clothed in camel's hair that announced his separation from the soft luxuries that so often accompany spiritual compromise and moral flexibility that values comfort over conviction. His entire being radiated the intensity of someone who had spent years in solitude learning to hear what heaven was saying while the rest of the world was distracted by earthly concerns that seemed urgent but would ultimately prove irrelevant to the great purposes of divine love working through human history. The Baptist's voice carried across flowing water with authority of ancient prophecy, being fulfilled in real time before the eyes of anyone with spiritual perception to recognize what was happening, calling people not to mere modification of behavior, but to complete transformation of heart and mind and purpose that went far deeper than external observance of religious customs that have lost their power to change lives because they had been divorced from the love that was supposed to flow through every commandment, like life-giving water through channels that had become clogged with pride and tradition and fear of change that might threaten carefully constructed identities built on performance rather than grace. The multitudes that came to him represented every stratum of Palestinian society: wealthy merchants whose success had not filled the emptiness in their souls, desperate beggars whose poverty had taught them truths about dependence that prosperity often obscures, learned scribes whose knowledge had somehow failed to produce the wisdom they sought, simple farmers whose closeness to soil and seasons had prepared their hearts to recognize authentic spiritual authority when they encountered it speaking truth that resonated in places they had forgotten they possessed. All of them were sensing that this wild-looking prophet spoke truths their hearts had been longing to hear, even when their minds could not fully grasp the implications of what he was proclaiming with such passionate conviction. Tax collectors who had grown comfortable with their collaboration with Roman authorities, their betrayal of their own people in exchange for financial security that had cost them their souls and their standing in communities that once welcomed them as neighbors and friends, found themselves under conviction so powerful they could no longer pretend that prosperity purchased through compromise was worth the price they had paid in self-respect and spiritual integrity. Their questions to John revealed hearts that had not been completely hardened by years of moral flexibility, souls that still remembered what it felt like to sleep peacefully with clear consciences and to look at themselves in mirrors without shame clouding their vision. Soldiers trained in violence and intimidation, men whose profession required them to think in terms of enemies and threats, whose survival depended on readiness to inflict pain and death upon others who might challenge their authority or threaten their interests or disturb the peace that served Roman purposes more than human flourishing, asked what they must do to live lives pleasing to the God they had been taught to fear but had never learned to love. Their weapons temporarily set aside as they contemplated the revolutionary possibility that there might be different ways to find security and meaning than through application of force and cultivation of fear in hearts that perhaps hungered for protection rather than domination. Religious leaders arrived to investigate this new teacher, some with genuinely seeking hearts that had grown weary of empty rituals and meaningless ceremonies that satisfied neither divine requirements nor human longings for authentic relationship with their Creator. Others with suspicious minds already prepared to find fault with anyone whose message challenged their carefully maintained positions of authority and influence within systems that served their personal interests more than they served divine purposes or human needs, crying out for compassionate response rather than additional religious requirements to fulfill or theological distinctions to master. The baptism that John offered in the muddy waters of Jordan was far more than ritual washing, designed to fulfill religious requirements or satisfy ceremonial obligations, but rather a powerful symbol of death and rebirth that spoke to something deeper than surface cleanliness, representing complete transformation that begins when old life is buried beneath waters that close over heads full of regrets and emerges dripping with possibilities for new beginnings that divine grace makes available to anyone willing to admit their need for cleansing they cannot provide for themselves, renewal they cannot achieve through their own efforts, forgiveness they cannot earn through good works but can only receive through humble acknowledgement of their absolute dependence upon divine mercy. Those who submitted to this baptism were acknowledging publicly their recognition that they needed cleansing from sins that stained souls more deeply than dirt stains clothing, that they hungered for righteousness they could not achieve through human effort alone, that they were ready to participate in divine purposes that transcended their individual understanding and personal ambitions and comfortable assumptions about how life should be lived according to standards they had inherited from cultures that knew prices of everything but values of nothing, that truly mattered to hearts created for communion with infinite love. Then came a morning that began like so many others but would be remembered as long as human hearts beat with hope for redemption, as long as souls search for meaning beyond material success and temporary pleasure, as long as creation groans for liberation that only divine intervention can provide in forms that exceed human imagination, while satisfying human need with precision that reveals intimate knowledge of what every heart requires for complete fulfillment. Jesus appeared among the crowd gathered at the river's edge, not as spectator observing religious phenomenon from safe distance, but as participant, seeking to identify completely with humanity's need for purification and renewal. When John saw him approaching through the multitude of people pressing toward the water, something in the Baptist spirit recognized immediately that this was the moment for which his entire ministry had been preparation. The arrival of the one whose coming he had been announcing with prophetic certainty, though he had never seen his face until this historic morning that would divide human history into before and after, into prophecy and fulfillment, into shadow and substance, into promise and reality walking among them in flesh and blood that could be touched and embraced and crucified, but could never be defeated because it carried within itself power of life over death, love over hatred, light over darkness that no earthly authority could extinguish. John's initial protest revealed his intuitive grasp of the cosmic reversal taking place before his eyes, his recognition that in the presence of this particular candidate for baptism, all normal categories and expectations were being turned upside down, that he was the one who needed what Jesus had to offer rather than the other way around, that the servant was suddenly face to face with his master, the forerunner confronting the one whose way he had been preparing through months of preaching that had drawn thousands to these muddy banks, but had all been leading to this single moment when prophecy would give way to fulfillment and preparation, would surrender to presence that transformed everything it touched. But Jesus insisted gently that this baptism was necessary, not because he needed cleansing, but because he needed to demonstrate complete identification with human experience, including the longing for purification that drives souls to seek renewal they cannot achieve through their own efforts, the hunger for righteousness that can only be satisfied by divine intervention in hearts that have tried everything else and found it wanting. As Jesus descended into Jordan's flowing waters that had witnessed so many symbolic deaths and rebirths, the very atmosphere around the river seemed to shimmer with anticipation, as if all creation recognized that something unprecedented was occurring, something that would mark the beginning of ministry destined to transform not just individual lives but the entire trajectory of human history. When Jesus emerged from the water, droplets streaming from his hair and beard, but his face radiant with something far more significant than physical refreshment, the heavens opened in ways that several witnesses would later describe as more profound than any natural phenomenon they had ever observed in lifetimes, spent watching weather patterns and seasonal changes. The Spirit of the living God descended upon him in the form of a dove, that ancient symbol of peace and new beginnings whose gentle landing upon his head spoke of divine approval so complete it needed no words to communicate what every heart present understood intuitively, that this was the beloved in whom divine love found perfect expression. Then came the voice, audible to some though not to all, words that revealed eternal relationship between Father and Son while announcing to anyone with ears to hear that the long-awaited time had finally arrived, that centuries of prophecy were about to find their fulfillment in this carpenter from Nazareth, who had just submitted to baptism like any other repentant sinner despite his complete freedom from anything requiring forgiveness. The voice declared with authority that echoed across water and through centuries to every heart that has ever wondered about divine love and acceptance, proclaiming truth that would anchor hope for generations yet unborn and provide foundation for faith that would survive every storm and overcome every obstacle and endure every test that time and circumstances could devise. Chapter 5. Words that changed everything on a hillside that rose gently from the northwestern shore of the Sea of Galilee, where wildflowers carpeted the grass and brilliant tapestries of scarlet and gold and purple that spoke of divine artistry too magnificent for human duplication, where morning air carried the fresh sweetness of water and growing things that had never known the pollution of industrial progress or the contamination of human ambition run wild. Jesus found the perfect natural amphitheater for words that would echo through centuries and transform countless hearts long after the flowers had faded and new generations of blossoms had taken their place in endless cycles of beauty that teach patient hearts about renewal and hope and faithfulness of divine love that never fails to provide exactly what each season requires for flourishing rather than mere survival. The crowd that had gathered to hear this rabbi, whose teaching carried power unlike anything they had experienced in synagogues, where learned men quoted other learned men in chains of interpretation that often obscured rather than illuminated the truths their souls desperately needed to hear, represented every level of Palestinian society and mixture that would have been remarkable in any other context, but seemed perfectly natural here, where human barriers dissolved in presence of one who saw hearts rather than external appearances, who valued souls rather than social status, who welcomed all who came with genuine hunger for truth that could satisfy longings buried so deep in human nature that many had forgotten such longings existed. Wealthy merchants sat beside poor laborers whose calloused hands spoke of honest work that earned barely enough to feed their families. Learned scribes found themselves surrounded by illiterate farmers whose closeness to soil and seasons had taught them wisdom that no amount of book learning could provide. Mothers holding babies shared space with elderly men whose bent backs carried weight of years spent in service to others, who may not have appreciated their sacrifices, but whose needs had been met through love that asked for no recognition or reward beyond the satisfaction that comes from giving what others require for their well-being and happiness. What united this diverse assembly was not social status or educational background or economic position, but hunger they all recognized in each other's faces, longing for something their souls knew they needed, but their minds struggled to name or define, or locate in a world that offered many forms of temporary satisfaction but seemed incapable of providing lasting peace that hearts created in divine image require for true flourishing, rather than mere survival from one disappointing day to another. Hoping tomorrow might bring fulfillment that today had promised but failed to deliver despite their best efforts to find it. When Jesus began to speak, his words fell into expectant silence like seeds, into soil that had been prepared by suffering and disappointment and years of religious instruction that had somehow failed to produce the righteousness it promised, or the joy it proclaimed, or the peace it claimed was available to anyone willing to follow rules that seemed designed more to exclude than include, more to burden than bless, more to demonstrate human inadequacy than divine sufficiency for every need that drives souls to seek something beyond what earth can provide to hearts that know they were made for heaven. Each phrase he spoke carried both immediate comfort for hearts weary of striving without achieving and long-term challenge that would require complete transformation of values and priorities and assumptions about what constitutes true success, genuine happiness, lasting security in a world where everything people typically trust eventually proves inadequate to bear weight of ultimate hope that human hearts place upon finite things that were never designed to carry such enormous expectations, or satisfy such deep longings, or provide such complete fulfillment as souls demand from their chosen sources of meaning and purpose and identity. He did not speak in technical language that religious professionals use to display their expertise or impress congregations with their learning, nor did he employ elaborate rhetoric that political leaders used to manipulate emotions and secure support for policies that served their interests more than common good. Instead, his words were so simple that children could understand their surface meaning, yet so profound that wisest philosophers would spend lifetimes exploring depths they had glimpsed in moments of insight, granted by grace rather than achieved through academic study or intellectual effort, that often produces knowledge without wisdom, information without understanding, facts without truth that transforms hearts and changes lives. Blessed are the poor in spirit, he began, and immediately the world's understanding of blessing was revolutionized in ways that challenged every assumption people had made about divine favor and human worthiness to receive it. In culture that equated material prosperity with spiritual blessing and interpreted earthly success as evidence of heavenly approval, Jesus was declaring that those who recognize their spiritual poverty, their complete inadequacy to meet divine standards through their own efforts, their desperate need for grace they could not earn or deserve or claim as right, but could only receive as gift offered freely by love that gives without calculating cost or expecting return, were the ones most positioned to inherit kingdom of heaven that operates according to principles completely opposite from those that govern earthly realms. Blessed are those who mourn, he continued, his voice carrying comfort that penetrated hearts carrying grief so deep they had wondered if joy would ever return to lives that had been shattered by losses too painful to accept, too final to reverse, too devastating to understand in any framework that made sense of divine goodness in a world where such terrible things happened to people who had tried to live faithfully and love generously and trust completely in promises that seemed to have been forgotten by the one who made them. Their tears were not evidence of divine displeasure or spiritual failure, but precious offerings treasured by heaven with intimate care that notices every drop and remembers every sorrow and promises. Healing for broken hearts that human comfort cannot reach and human wisdom cannot explain and human strength cannot restore to wholeness. Sorrow itself, in the mysterious economy of divine love, became pathway to comfort that could only come from the ultimate source of consolation. Joy that emerged not despite grief, but through grief that had been transformed by divine alchemy from poison into medicine, from ending into beginning, from death into resurrection, life that proves stronger than every force that opposes, human flourishing and divine purposes that will not be defeated by temporary appearances of failure or setback or loss. That breaks hearts but cannot break the love that holds universe together and calls every wandering child home to arms that never grow tired of embracing prodigals returning from far countries, where they spent their inheritance on pleasures that promised much but delivered little except emptiness. Blessed are the meek, Jesus declared with quiet authority that demonstrated the very quality he was describing, transforming gentleness from weakness into strength and humility from failure into path to true greatness that lasts, beyond earthly recognition or reward that fades like morning mist when tested by time and changing circumstances. In society where power belonged to those willing to seize it through force or cunning, where success required aggressive self-promotion and ruthless elimination of competition, where survival seemed to demand hardness of heart and calculating selfishness that treated others as obstacles to overcome or resources to exploit, Jesus was revealing that ultimate victory belonged to those whose strength expressed itself through tenderness toward vulnerable and service to those in need. The earth itself, he promised with certainty, that carried weight of divine decree that cannot be overturned by human opposition or natural disaster, or any force that presumes to challenge purposes established before foundation of world was laid. would ultimately belong not to those who grasped for territory through violence or accumulated possessions through greed or dominated others through manipulation that played upon their fears and weaknesses, but to those whose gentle spirits reflected character of divine love that conquers through service rather than force, that leads through example rather than coercion, that transforms enemies into friends, through persistent kindness that eventually melts hardest hearts and opens most tightly closed minds. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, he continued, acknowledging deep longing that drove people to gather on this hillside, despite obligations that called them elsewhere and responsibilities that demanded their attention and daily concerns that normally consumed their thoughts and energy. This hunger was not satisfied by external performance that might impress human observers, but left souls still starving for authenticity, not quenched by religious activity that might earn approval from institutional authorities, but provided no real nourishment for hearts created for relationship with living God rather than dead rituals that had lost their power to transform lives or connect souls with love that gives meaning to existence. Those who genuinely craved righteousness with intensity that matched physical hunger and thirst would be filled, he promised, not through their own efforts to achieve moral perfection that always fell short of divine standards, but through divine provision of righteousness that comes as gift to those whose hearts have been prepared by recognition of their need, and whose hands have been emptied of attempts to earn what can only be received through grace that flows from source of all goodness too. Anyone willing to acknowledge their spiritual poverty and accept divine wealth offered without price or condition or requirement for proof of worthiness. Blessed are the merciful, Jesus taught with voice that carried authority of one who had shown mercy to countless hearts that had no claim upon his compassion except their desperate need for forgiveness. They could not provide for themselves, and grace they could not purchase through any payment they might offer in exchange for relief from guilt that haunted their days and shame that poisoned their nights. Those who showed mercy to others who had wronged them or disappointed them or failed to meet their expectations would themselves receive mercy from divine heart that specializes in forgiveness and delights in restoration and never grows weary of offering fresh starts to those who have exhausted human patience but have not yet exhausted divine love that knows no limits. This mercy was not weakness that enabled destructive behavior or sentimentality that ignored justice and accountability, but strength that chose to absorb pain rather than inflict it, wisdom that understood broken people need healing more than condemnation, love that recognized potential for transformation in hearts that seemed beyond hope of redemption according to human judgment that sees present condition rather than future possibility that divine grace can accomplish in cooperation with human willingness to be changed from glory to glory through power that works within those who trust completely. Blessed are the pure in heart, he declared, speaking to longing for inner clarity that had been clouded by compromise and confusion and competing loyalties that pulled souls in different directions until they no longer knew what they truly valued or desired or believed about ultimate questions that determine how life should be lived and what purposes are worth pursuing regardless of cost. Those whose hearts had been cleansed by divine forgiveness and unified by divine love would see God, not just in future heavenly realm, but in present earthly circumstances where divine presence could be recognized by eyes that had been open to perceive spiritual realities, normally hidden from vision that focuses only on material surfaces. This purity was not achieved through human effort to eliminate every imperfect thought or emotion that arose in minds still affected by sinful nature that wars against spiritual aspirations, but received through divine grace that covers sins with righteousness of Christ and transforms hearts through love that makes holiness attractive rather than burdensome, possible rather than impossible, joy rather than duty that weighs down spirits and crushes hope of ever-pleasing God, whose standards seem designed to discourage rather than inspire those who long to live according to divine will but found themselves constantly falling short of perfection that seemed required, but remained unattainable. Blessed are the peacemakers, Jesus continued, calling attention to those who worked to heal divisions that separated people from one another, and from God who created them for unity rather than discord, for harmony rather than conflict that arises when human pride refuses to yield to divine love, and human selfishness insists on rights and privileges that create barriers between hearts that were meant to beat in rhythm with divine heart that loves all equally and desires reconciliation more than vindication, restoration more than punishment, mercy more than justice that gives people what they deserve rather than what they need for wholeness. These peacemakers would be called children of God because they reflected family resemblance to Heavenly Father, whose nature is love and whose purposes are always directed toward healing rather than harming, toward building up rather than tearing down, toward creating rather than destroying what He has made and called good, despite its current brokenness, that calls for redemption rather than condemnation, for restoration rather than abandonment by love, that never gives up on what it has created for relationship and fellowship and joy, that transcends every temporary sorrow and outlasts every temporal disappointment. Chapter 6. Miracles of Compassion as Word of Jesus is extraordinary. Teaching spread like ripples across the still surface of Galilee's social landscape, reaching into villages and towns where stories of hope and healing traveled faster than any Roman messenger could carry official dispatches, where conversations around wells and in marketplaces began to center on this carpenter-turned-teacher, whose words carried weight that pressed against hearts and opened them to possibilities they had never dared imagine. Something else began happening that amazed everyone who witnessed it firsthand or heard reliable accounts from neighbors whose integrity vouched for truth of testimonies that challenged every natural law yet were corroborated by too many credible witnesses to dismiss as wishful thinking or mass hysteria or elaborate deception designed to promote false profit. The same divine power that flowed through His teachings like living water through channels that had been dry for generations began manifesting itself in healings and restorations that defied medical explanation while demonstrating heart of divine love toward every form of suffering that mars beauty of creation and breaks hearts of creatures, made an image of perfect wholeness that sin has corrupted, but grace can restore to original design. These were not theatrical displays designed to impress crowds or validate theological credentials or establish institutional authority over populations seeking spiritual leadership, but spontaneous responses to human need that revealed what divine compassion looks like when it encounters pain and brokenness with power sufficient to restore what was lost and heal what was wounded. In busy fishing village of Capernaum, where morning air carried mingled scents of nets drying in, Mediterranean sun and bread baking in ovens tended by women whose hands had learned to transform simple grain into nourishment that sustained families through seasons of plenty and seasons of want, a Roman centurion's beloved servant lay dying on bed that had become his prison, consumed by fever that burned away his strength and paralysis that stole his mobility, leaving him completely dependent on others for every need while his condition resisted every treatment most skilled physicians could provide with all their accumulated knowledge and expensive remedies that promised much but delivered little, except additional suffering. This military officer, though representing occupying forces that many Jews regarded as enemies of everything they held sacred about their faith and culture and national identity, had somehow transcended ethnic and political barriers that typically separated conqueror from conquered by demonstrating fairness in his dealings and genuine care for people under his authority that went far beyond mere professional duty or calculated self-interest, designed to maintain peace and order that served Ramang purposes more than human welfare. His love for Jewish customs and respect for Jewish faith had moved him to fund construction of their local synagogue with his own resources, not as political gesture designed to win favor or maintain stability, but as authentic expression of appreciation for spiritual truths that had touched his heart despite his foreign birth and military training. When news reached him that Jesus was approaching Capernaum, something in Centurion's spirit recognized that this teacher from Nazareth possessed authority of completely different kind than any earthly power. He had known in years of military service under various commanders who wielded authority through force and maintained discipline, through fear of punishment that might range from loss of pay to loss of life, depending on severity of offense and mood of superior officers whose decisions could not be questioned or appealed once they had been rendered with finality that left no room for mercy or reconsideration, based on changed circumstances or new information that might affect justice of original judgment. His faith was so profound and his understanding of spiritual authority so clear that he sent word to Jesus through Jewish elders who could vouch for his character and petition on behalf of someone whose ethnic background might prejudice less generous hearts against his request, explaining that there was no need for teacher to actually visit his house where ceremonial defilement might result from contact with Gentile dwelling, that he need only speak word from whatever distance seemed appropriate, and healing would occur as surely as soldiers obeyed commands from legitimate authority that expected compliance without question or delay or partial obedience that would undermine entire system of military organization. The faith demonstrated by this Gentile soldier amazed even Jesus, who declared to Jewish crowds following him that he had not found such trust anywhere in Israel among people who had been raised from childhood with stories of divine power and miraculous interventions that should have prepared them to recognize supernatural authority when it appeared among them in human form, but somehow had been obscured by familiarity that breeds contempt or expectation that makes extraordinary seem ordinary, until something breaks through accumulated assumptions to reveal wonder that had been hidden in plain sight. At very moment Jesus spoke words of healing from miles away, without any physical contact or medical intervention or gradual process of recovery that might be explained through natural means or attributed to coincidental improvement that sometimes occurs when bodies rally their own resources against disease. Centurion's servant opened eyes that had been closed in semi-conscious delirium, sat up in bed that had seemed destined to become his deathbed, asked for food with appetite that had been absent for weeks, and discovered that both fever and paralysis had disappeared as completely as if they had never existed, leaving behind no weakness or residual effects, but only perfect health that testified to power greater than disease. On another day, as Jesus was teaching beside shore where fishing boats bobbed gently in shallow water that reflected sky so perfectly it was difficult to tell where heaven ended and earth began, where children played in sand while their mothers listened to words that spoke to longings buried so deep in their hearts they had almost forgotten such longings existed beneath daily concerns about food and clothing and shelter that consumed most of their thoughts and energy. A woman who had suffered from hemorrhaging for 12 long years pressed through crowd that surrounded him like living wall between ordinary people and extraordinary teacher whose presence seemed to create its own atmosphere where hope became possible and healing became reality rather than distant dream. She had spent everything she owned on physicians whose treatments had only made her condition worse through procedures that promised much but delivered additional pain while draining her financial resources and leaving her not only physically weaker but economically devastated, socially isolated by religious laws that declared her ceremonially unclean and therefore unable to participate in community, worship or family celebrations or normal interactions that give life meaning and purpose beyond mere biological survival from one disappointing day to another that brought fresh reminders of limitations that seemed permanent and losses that appeared irreversible according to every medical opinion she had received. For over decades she had lived as exile in her own town, watching life go by from margins where shame and physical suffering had relegated her, growing progressively weaker while her hope dwindled to barely visible flicker that threatened to be extinguished completely by next medical setback or financial crisis or social rejection that reminded her how completely her condition had separated her from everything that makes existence bearable, let alone enjoyable. But reports about Jesus had reached even shadows where outcasts dwell. Stories of compassion extended to sinners and grace offered to those whom religious authorities had declared beyond divine concern. Her faith was desperate but certain, born from kind of hope that emerges only when every other option has been exhausted. Yet something in Soul refuses to surrender completely to despair that poses as realism but is actually rebellion against divine love that never gives up on anyone created in divine image for divine purposes that suffering may obscure but cannot ultimately defeat. If I can just touch edge of his garment, she whispered to herself as she pushed through crowd with determination, fueled by 12 years of longing for freedom from condition that had stolen her dignity along with her health. I know I will be healed by power that flows through this man who treats outcasts like family and sinners like saints. When her trembling fingers barely grazed hem of his cloak as he passed by, divine power flowed from Jesus like electricity seeking ground. And immediately she felt hemorrhaging stop with finality that convinced her healing was complete and permanent. Felt strength returning to body that had been drained by years of constant blood loss. Felt shame and isolation that had defined her existence lifted away like heavy garment she had worn so long she had forgotten what it felt like to stand straight and breathe freely and look people in eye without fear of disgust or rejection or ceremonial contamination that would require their ritual cleansing. Jesus, sensing that healing power had gone out from him like river flowing toward thirsty ground, stopped walking and turned to crowd with question, born not of irritation, being touched without permission, but of desire to complete what had begun with physical healing by adding blessing of personal recognition and restored dignity that would matter as much as bodily restoration in life of someone who had been treated as untouchable pariah rather than beloved daughter of God, whose worth had never been diminished in divine eyes despite what earthly circumstances had seemed to suggest about her value and acceptability to those who should have shown compassion. "Who touched me?" he asked gently, his question revealing heart that cared not only about miracles, but about people who received them. Not only about demonstrations of power, but about relationships that power was meant to restore between isolated souls and communities that had forgotten how to welcome those whom society had rejected as unworthy of love or attention or basic human kindness that should characterize people who claim to worship God of mercy and grace. When woman came forward, terrified yet compelled by kindness in his voice, expecting rebuke for her presumption, but receiving instead words that transformed her understanding of her own worth and place in community of faith, Jesus looked at her with infinite tenderness and spoke recognition that welcomed her back into human family. "Daughter," he said, and in that single word she was no longer outcast or unclean woman or social pariah, but daughter welcomed home after long absence. Family member whose place at table had been kept waiting for her return. Beloved child whose worth had never been diminished in eyes of heavenly Father despite what earthly circumstances had seemed to suggest about her acceptability to those who should have reflected divine love rather than human prejudice and fear of contamination that confused physical condition with spiritual status. "Your faith has healed you," Jesus continued, attributing miracle not to his power alone, but to trust she had demonstrated in approaching him despite every social and religious barrier that should have kept her away. Faith that had reached across gulf of separation to touch hem of one who had come specifically to heal broken-hearted and bind up wounded spirits wherever they might be found suffering in silence or crying out for help that seemed never to come from sources they had been taught to trust for spiritual guidance and practical assistance. Chapter 7. Walking among the people, what distinguished Jesus' ministry from every other religious movement of his time. What set him apart from countless other teachers and prophets and reformers who appeared throughout Palestine claiming divine authority for their particular interpretations of ancient texts or their specific programs for spiritual renewal that would restore Israel to former glory and divine favor. was not merely power of his teachings or wonder of his miracles, though both were extraordinary beyond anything his contemporaries had ever witnessed or imagined possible within boundaries of human experience, shaped by generations of disappointment and unmet expectations about messianic deliverance. The truly revolutionary aspect of his approach was way he moved through world like someone who belonged everywhere and was welcome nowhere according to conventional standards that measured worthiness by social status and religious credentials and ethnic purity and moral performance that created hierarchies of acceptability in communities that had forgotten their original calling to be light to nations through demonstration of divine love rather than human prejudice, disguised as spiritual discernment. The people he chose to spend time with when he could have surrounded himself with influential supporters and wealthy patrons who might have advanced his cause through their connections and resources revealed heart that valued souls over systems, relationships over regulations, love over law that had been transformed from pathway to life into burden too heavy for human shoulders to bear. The social barriers he consistently crossed with such natural grace that observers were left breathless by casual way. He dismantled centuries of carefully constructed divisions, simply by treating every person as if they possessed infinite worth in eyes of divine love. Challenged every assumption about divine favor and human worthiness that had been built up through generations of religious teaching designed more to exclude than include, more to separate worthy from unworthy than to reveal universal need for grace that no human being could earn through performance or achieve through effort, but could only receive through humble acceptance of gift offered freely to anyone willing to acknowledge their spiritual poverty. In bustling marketplaces where merchants hawked their wares under colorful awnings that provided relief from Mediterranean sun, where air filled with sounds of bargaining conducted in multiple languages by people whose diverse backgrounds reflected Galilee's position as crossroads between different cultures and civilizations that had learned to coexist through necessity, if not always through genuine understanding. Jesus walked with relaxed familiarity of someone completely comfortable among ordinary people, living ordinary lives filled with extraordinary dignity that came from being image bearers of divine love, whether they recognized that identity or had forgotten it, through years of being treated as less than human by those who considered themselves more favored by God. Unlike religious leaders who maintained careful distance from anyone whose contact might compromise their ritual purity or threaten their social standing, with authorities who valued conformity more than compassion and order more than justice that sometimes requires disruption of systems that serve privileged few at expense of vulnerable many. Jesus seemed to genuinely enjoy company of tax collectors whose collaboration with Roman occupation forces had made them wealthy but miserable, of fishermen whose honest labor connected them to rhythms older than human memory, of former prostitutes whose past provided no barrier to present transformation when they encountered love that saw not what they had been, but what they could become through grace. He would pause at potters' workshops where skilled hands shaped clay into vessels useful and beautiful, examining their work with genuine interest while asking questions that revealed not condescension, but authentic curiosity about crafts that had been passed down through generations of families whose understanding of their work transcended mere economics to embrace something closer to worship, to partnership with creative forces that turn earth into art, raw materials into objects that serve human need while reflecting divine beauty that speaks to souls hungry for evidence that this world contains more than random collision of atoms governed by impersonal laws. At bakers' stalls where warm fragrances of fresh bread mixed with conversations about weather and politics and community news that connected neighbors to shared life that extended beyond individual concerns to encompass collective hopes and fears and dreams. Jesus would breathe deeply of scents that reminded him of his mother's kitchen, where love was expressed through meals prepared with care that nourished more than bodies, that fed souls hungry for evidence that someone cared enough about their well-being to invest time and effort in providing sustenance that spoke of home and belonging, and acceptance that asked no questions about worthiness. His words transformed everyday experiences into windows through which listeners could glimpse eternal realities normally hidden behind veils of familiarity that make miraculous seem mundane, and sacred appear ordinary until someone with eyes to see and voice to explain reveals depths of meaning that had been present all along but required divine revelation to become visible to hearts that had grown accustomed to surface appearances rather than underlying truths that give significance to moments that might otherwise seem trivial or forgettable, but actually pulse with purpose. Children seemed especially drawn to Jesus with instinctive recognition that bypassed intellectual analysis and went straight to heart's understanding of who could be trusted with fears and dreams and questions that adults often dismissed as unimportant or naive, but which actually represented purest expressions of human need for love that accepts without condition, guidance that leads without manipulation, protection that never fails even when circumstances suggest otherwise. They sensed in him kind of adult who would listen to their concerns without condescension, who would enter into their games without embarrassment, who would take seriously their observations about life that often revealed truths sophisticated minds had overlooked. When his disciples attempted to discourage such interruptions, thinking their master's time was too valuable to be spent on those who could contribute nothing to his mission except interruption and distraction from more important work of teaching adults who had influence and resources that might advance kingdom purposes through channels that children could never provide. Jesus' response revealed heart of his entire approach to ministry and relationship and values that would characterize communities formed in his name when they remembered his example rather than substituting human wisdom for divine priorities. "Let little children come to me," he said with authority that stopped his disciples' protective intervention while revealing truth they had not yet grasped about nature of kingdom he had come to establish, and do not hinder them. For kingdom of heaven belongs to such as these, in their unguarded trust that had not yet learned to doubt promises made by those who claim to love them, in their capacity for wonder that found miracles in ordinary moments and saw beauty in simple things, in their willingness to believe good things about people they had just met rather than approaching every new relationship with suspicion and calculation. Jesus found perfect illustrations of faith that opens hearts to receive divine love without reservation. He would sit on ground with them, regardless of dust that gathered on robes that marked him as teacher deserving respect, listening to their excited chatter about treasures they had discovered or adventures they had imagined, entering into their world with such genuine delight that they forgot he was anyone other than friend who cared about what mattered to them and understood that sometimes what matters most to children reveals truths that escape adult attention, because maturity often means learning to ignore wonder in favor of worry, to replace curiosity with cynicism, to substitute calculation for spontaneous love. When Samaritan woman approached Jacob's well during noon heat, timing her visit to avoid other women who normally gathered there in cooler morning hours, she expected to draw her water in solitude and return home without encountering anyone who might remind her of shame and disappointment that had marked her recent years with series of failed relationships that had left her isolated even among people who were themselves outcasts from Jewish perspective. The last thing she anticipated was finding Jewish rabbi sitting beside well, and she certainly never imagined that he would speak to her, let alone ask her for a drink of water in violation of every social convention governing interactions between Jews and Samaritans, men and women, religious teachers and social outcasts. The conversation that unfolded revealed both Jesus' supernatural knowledge of her personal history and his profound compassion for loneliness and searching that had driven her from one relationship to another in futile attempt to find someone who could satisfy deep thirst of her heart for love that would never disappoint or abandon her when difficulties arose or novelty wore off and human limitations became apparent to partners who had initially seemed like answers to prayers but had proven to be just more questions in lives already, filled with uncertainties about purpose and meaning and possibility of genuine happiness. Instead of condemnation she expected from religious teacher who should have been offended by her presence and scandalized by her history, he offered her living water, kind that would spring up from within her own soul and become source of satisfaction that no earthly relationship could provide or destroy. Eternal spring that would never run dry regardless of circumstances or human failures, that had taught her not to expect permanence or faithfulness from anyone who claimed to care about her welfare and happiness, but had proven unable or unwilling to provide security her heart craved. Chapter 8. Fellow Seekers of Peace. As we pause here together in our sacred journey through life and love of this extraordinary man who walked among people of his time with such revolutionary grace, my beloved companion on this path toward rest that your weary soul has been seeking through all noise and chaos of days that have asked more of your heart than seemed humanly possible to give. I want to take a moment to acknowledge something beautiful that has been happening in quiet chambers of your spirit as we have breathed together same holy air that surrounded Jesus during those remarkable years when heaven touched earth in ways that transformed everything they encountered. We have walked beside him through dusty streets of villages where his presence brought healing to broken bodies and hope to discouraged hearts. We have listened as his words fell like gentle rain on souls, parched by disappointment and disillusionment with religious systems that promised much but delivered little in terms of genuine transformation or authentic relationship with divine love that human hearts were created to know and experience. We have witnessed his compassion toward outcasts and sinners, his patient love for confused disciples, his revolutionary approach to social barriers that had separated people from each other and from God for generations beyond counting. You are not alone in this experience of encountering something larger and more tender than your troubles through these timeless narratives that speak across centuries to address needs that remain essentially unchanged despite all technological advances and cultural developments that have transformed external circumstances of human existence, while leaving deepest hungers of human hearts exactly as they were when Jesus first spoke words of comfort to crowds gathered on Galilean hillsides where wildflowers painted grass with colors no earthly artist has ever managed to duplicate completely. All around our world tonight, other souls exactly like yours have found their way to this same sanctuary of contemplation. Other weary hearts seeking same rest you are discovering. Other searching spirits drawn by same irresistible pull towards something they cannot name, but cannot ignore. Something that feels like coming home to a place they have never been, but somehow recognize as destination toward which their deepest longings have always been pointing without their conscious awareness of direction or purpose that had been guiding their steps through a maze of choices and circumstances that had seemed random but were actually part of divine plan unfolding according to wisdom that exceeds human understanding. There is something profoundly moving about this invisible community of seekers that has formed around these sacred stories, this fellowship of hearts that spans continents and cultures and centuries. United not by geography or background or shared external circumstances, but by common recognition that our souls were made for more than endless cycle of stress and striving that characterizes so much of contemporary existence, that our hearts contain chambers that can only be filled by connection with love that never fails and never abandons and never grows weary of extending grace to those who have exhausted their own resources and discovered that human strength is insufficient for challenges that life presents. Some who join us in this quiet contemplation tonight are longtime pilgrims whose feet have walked these pathways of faith for many decades, whose hearts have been seasoned by years of learning to distinguish between voices that promise much but deliver little and voice that speaks with authority derived not from human credentials, but from divine love that proves itself faithful through seasons of abundance and seasons of scarcity. Through times of clarity when purposes seem obvious and times of confusion when nothing makes sense, except steady presence of love that remains constant when everything else changes. Others may be newer to this kind of spiritual exploration, their hearts cautiously opening to possibilities they may have dismissed in earlier chapters of their lives when cynicism seemed like wisdom and skepticism felt like protection against disappointment. That comes when hearts dare to believe in goodness that seems too beautiful to be real, too generous to be true, too wonderful to be available to ordinary people like themselves who have made too many mistakes and carry too many regrets and bear too many wounds to qualify for kind of love that songs celebrate and poets describe and preachers proclaim. Whether you arrive in this peaceful space as seasoned traveler whose spiritual passport bears stamps from many encounters with divine grace, or as curious newcomer, taking tentative first steps into territories that feel both foreign and mysteriously familiar, like landscapes glimpsed in dreams that seem more real than waking life, you are equally welcome in this community of hearts that have learned to recognize their need for something beyond what visible world can provide to souls created for relationship with invisible love that makes itself known through countless expressions of beauty and goodness and truth. If these stories of Jesus' compassion toward those whom society had rejected have stirred something beautiful in your spirit tonight, if his interactions with children and tax collectors and fishermen and all ordinary people who found in his presence extraordinary grace they had been seeking, without knowing where to look or how to ask or whether they had any right to expect, such generosity from source that had seemed distant and demanding rather than near and welcoming, if his patient love for confused disciples who asked obvious questions and made embarrassing mistakes yet were chosen for purposes that exceeded their understanding, has helped you believe that you too might be worthy of such tender acceptance, then I want to extend to you invitation that Jesus offered to everyone whose path crossed his. You are invited to become part of our growing family of fellow seekers who have discovered that spiritual rest is not luxury reserved for those who have achieved some level of spiritual maturity or theological understanding, but necessity as fundamental to human flourishing as food and water and air, that these quiet moments of encounter with divine love are not optional additions to life that can be postponed until more convenient seasons when schedules allow for such indulgences, but essential nourishment for souls that were created for relationship with their Maker and will never find true satisfaction in anything less. By choosing to walk with us through these contemplative narratives, by allowing your heart to be touched by same love that transformed fishermen into apostles and tax collectors, into evangelists and skeptics, into believers who were willing to sacrifice everything they had previously considered important for sake of something infinitely more valuable, you become part of something that transcends individual experience and becomes participation in eternal story of divine love pursuing human hearts across every barrier of time and culture and circumstance. Your presence in this community matters more than you might realize, dear friend, because when you open your heart to receive divine love through these ancient stories, you create ripples that extend far beyond your individual experience to bless everyone whose path intersects with yours in days and weeks and months ahead. Everyone who encounters in your eyes something of peace you have found, who hears in your voice something of hope you have received, who senses in your presence something of love that has claimed you as its own. Please know that your thoughts about this journey we are sharing together tonight, whatever particular moments in Jesus' story have spoken most directly to your own need for hope or healing or forgiveness, or simply assurance that you matter to someone whose love never fails, are deeply valued and warmly welcomed in comments where hearts can share honestly about their spiritual journeys, without fear of judgment from those who think they have progressed further along pathways that all lead to same destination where love waits with infinite patience. Sometimes people hesitate to engage with spiritual content in public forums, wondering if their faith is strong enough or their understanding deep enough or their questions sophisticated enough to contribute meaningfully to conversations about divine love and eternal truth that seem to require expertise they have not acquired through formal education or credentials they do not possess through institutional affiliation. But remember, disciples, we have observed throughout these stories ordinary men with extraordinary flaws who asked obvious questions and made embarrassing mistakes, yet were chosen by Jesus and entrusted with most important message in human history, because their hearts remained open to transformation. Your questions reveal seeking heart, and seeking hearts are exactly what divine love delights to find and satisfy with truth that brings both comfort for present struggles and hope for future possibilities. Your struggles connect you to universal human experience of wrestling with doubt and disappointment that has characterized every generation since paradise was lost and people began wondering whether it could ever be regained through anything other than divine intervention that comes as gift, rather than reward earned through religious performance or moral achievement. In weeks and months ahead, we will continue exploring stories that possess power to heal wounded hearts and restore hope to discouraged spirits, journeying together through experiences of saints and mystics who discovered divine presence in desert solitudes and mountain retreats where silence taught them truths that noise obscures and solitude revealed relationships that crowds complicate. Learning how their encounters with divine love can illuminate our own spiritual paths and provide practical wisdom for contemporary challenges. Chapter 9. The 12 and Their Stories. As reputation of this carpenter-turned-teacher continued spreading throughout Palestine like morning light, gradually illuminating landscape that had been hidden in darkness. Reaching into villages where his name was whispered around cooking fires and his deeds discussed in synagogues where learned men struggled to categorize someone who fit no existing rabbinical pattern. Jesus recognized growing need for companions who could share not only in his daily ministry, but in his deeper mission of demonstrating divine love to a world that had almost forgotten what such love looked like, when clothed in human flesh and expressed through human relationships that transcended every barrier society had constructed to separate worthy from unworthy. From among larger group of followers who had begun gathering wherever he went, drawn by teachings that spoke to longings buried so deep in their hearts, they had almost forgotten such longings existed. Attracted by healings that restored not just physical function, but hope for futures worth living. Inspired by presence that somehow made ordinary moments feel sacred and common encounters seem charged with eternal significance. Jesus chose 12 men to serve as his apostles, his sent ones, who would eventually carry his message to ends of earth, long after his physical presence had been removed from world that would never be same. These 12 were not kind of men that religious establishments typically selected for positions of spiritual authority or institutional leadership. Not polished scholars who had mastered intricate details of scriptural interpretation through years of study in prestigious schools where theological degrees were earned by memorizing commentaries written by previous generations of experts who had built elaborate systems of thought that often obscured simple truths they were meant to clarify. They were not socially prominent figures whose endorsement might lend credibility to new movement or whose financial resources might provide security for organization that would need material support to accomplish spiritual purposes. Instead, Jesus chose ordinary working men whose hearts remained tender enough to recognize divine love when it called their names and invited them into adventure beyond anything their limited imaginations could have conceived, whose souls had not been hardened by success that might make them feel self-sufficient or cynical about possibilities for transformation that seemed too good to be true, to minds that had learned to expect disappointment rather than hope for fulfillment that exceeded their modest dreams about what life might offer to people of their humble background and limited prospects for advancement. Simon, whom Jesus renamed Peter with prophetic insight that looked beyond present instability to future strength that would be forged through failures that taught him complete dependence upon divine grace rather than human determination, brought to their fellowship passionate intensity of natural leader, whose enthusiasm often exceeded his wisdom, but whose love for his master ran deeper than sea from which he had drawn his living for so many years, before hearing call that would transform him from fisherman to fisher of men, whose nets would draw souls from depths of despair to shores of hope that Jesus offered to everyone willing to follow wherever love might lead. Peter possessed kind of personality that spoke first and thought later, that acted on impulse rather than careful reflection, that promised more than human strength could deliver, yet somehow always found reserves of divine grace sufficient for whatever challenges love placed before him, when he learned to depend not on his own resources but on power that worked through weakness rather than despite it, that transformed failures into testimonies of divine faithfulness and mistakes into stepping stones towards spiritual maturity that could only be achieved through humbling experiences that broke pride and built dependence. His journey from impulsive fisherman to rock-solid apostle would take him through depths of failure that would have destroyed lesser souls and heights of faithfulness that would inspire countless generations of believers who would find in his story encouragement for their own struggles with inconsistency and hope for their own potential despite present limitations that seemed to disqualify them for spiritual service or divine purposes that required stronger characters than they possessed, according to their own honest self-assessment that made them wonder how God could possibly use such flawed instruments. Andrew, Peter's younger brother, brought quieter but equally devoted heart to their fellowship, possessing kind of personality that preferred to work behind scenes rather than in spotlight that attracted his more dramatic sibling, whose greatest joy came not from public recognition of his own contributions, but from introducing others to a teacher who had changed his life in ways that made him want to share that transformation with everyone he met. Andrew had gift of seeing potential in unlikely people and creating opportunities for them to encounter Jesus personally, beginning with his own brother and continuing throughout their years, together with consistent ministry of connection that built bridges between seeking hearts and love they were seeking without always knowing how to find it. His faithful service behind scenes, his willingness to take secondary role while his brother received more attention and recognition, his persistent efforts to bring others into circle of divine love rather than focusing on his own advancement or spiritual development, demonstrated kind of humble greatness that Jesus consistently praised above dramatic gestures that impressed crowds but sometimes concealed pride that sought glory for itself rather than directing all honor towards source of every good gift and perfect blessing that flows from above to hearts that have learned to receive with gratitude. James and John, sons of Zebedee, whose father had built successful fishing enterprise that provided comfortable living for their family until Jesus called them to abandon nets and boats for adventure that would prove far more rewarding than any material success they might have achieved by continuing in commercial fishing that brought temporary security but could never satisfy longings for meaning and purpose that their souls recognized when they encountered someone whose mission connected individual lives to eternal purposes that would outlast every earthly kingdom. These brothers carried nicknames that revealed their fiery temperaments and quick reactions to anything that seemed to threaten or dishonor their beloved master, earning title Sons of Thunder because of their readiness to call down divine judgment upon anyone who failed to receive Jesus with proper respect or showed insufficient appreciation for teachings that seemed so obviously true and beneficial that opposition could only be explained through willful blindness or deliberate wickedness that deserved immediate and severe punishment, rather than patient instruction that might eventually open closed minds and soften hardened hearts. Their passionate natures served them well in some situations, where righteous indignation was appropriate response to injustice or boldness was needed to proclaim truth in hostile environments, but their reactions often required redirection from destructive impulses toward constructive expressions of their zeal for divine honor and human welfare. Under Jesus' patient influence that never tried to crush their spirits but rather channeled their energy into forms that would bless rather than burden those they were meant to serve, their capacity for righteous anger would be transformed into equally passionate love that would eventually cost them everything they had to give. Philip approached discipleship with careful, analytical mind of someone who liked to understand things thoroughly before committing himself completely to courses of action that might prove costly or difficult to reverse once begun, whose practical nature sometimes struggled with supernatural dimensions of following Jesus, but whose intellectual honesty kept him asking questions until he found answers satisfactory enough to justify continued participation in movement that challenged many assumptions he had held about how divine power operates in human affairs. When Jesus tested Philip's faith by asking how they could possibly feed a crowd of 5,000 people with resources that seemed laughably inadequate for such an enormous task, Philip immediately began calculating costs and logistics with systematic precision that revealed his organized approach to problem solving, but also his inability to conceive solutions that transcended ordinary human resources and conventional methods. For addressing overwhelming needs that appeared impossible to meet through any means available to a small group of disciples with limited funds. His questions were never frivolous or designed to create difficulties, but reflected genuine desire to understand principles that governed relationship between human effort and divine provision, between natural means and supernatural results, between faith that trusts completely and wisdom that plans carefully for contingencies that might arise when good intentions encounter practical obstacles that could derail even worthy projects unless adequate preparation has been made for challenges that experience suggests will inevitably appear to test commitment and resourcefulness. Nathanael, also called Bartholomew, initially approached Jesus with skepticism of someone whose knowledge of geography and prophecy made him doubt that anything significant could emerge from village as insignificant as Nazareth, whose reputation among learned men was not particularly impressive and whose claim to prophetic significance seemed to contradict scriptural expectations about origins of Messiah, who was supposed to come from Bethlehem according to ancient prophecies that had been studied and debated for generations by scholars who prided themselves on their careful attention to textual details. His honest questions revealed not cynicism but genuine desire to understand truth, not rejection of divine revelation, but careful evaluation of claims that seemed too wonderful to believe, without adequate evidence that could satisfy both heart and mind, seeking authentic encounter with living God rather than deception perpetrated by false prophet whose credentials could not withstand scrutiny applied by those who had learned to distinguish between genuine spiritual authority and clever manipulation designed to exploit religious longings for personal gain or political advantage. When Jesus demonstrated supernatural knowledge of his character and activities, describing him as true Israelite, in whom there was no deceit before they had ever met or spoken, Nathanael's skepticism dissolved into worship that was all more profound because it had been preceded by honest doubt rather than uncritical acceptance of extraordinary claims that required faith to embrace fully. His transformation from skeptic to believer became pattern for many who would encounter Jesus, through honest questioning that leads to genuine faith rather than superficial acceptance that crumbles under pressure. Matthew brought to their group unique perspective of someone who had collaborated with Roman authorities for personal profit, who understood corruption of occupying power from inside its system, who knew what it meant to be despised by his own people for choices that had enriched him financially while impoverishing him spiritually and socially, cutting him off from communities that had once welcomed him as neighbor and friend, but now treated him as traitor whose presence reminded them of their own compromises with forces they claimed to oppose. His transformation from tax collector to apostle became living proof that no past was too shameful, no reputation too damaged, no heart too hardened to be reached by divine love and restored to usefulness in kingdom of heaven that operates according to principles of grace rather than merit, forgiveness rather than condemnation, redemption rather than rejection of those whose failures had separated them from respectable society but had not separated them from divine love that specializes in restoration of broken lives and damaged relationships. Thomas, forever remembered primarily for his post-resurrection doubts rather than his pre-crucifixion courage, actually demonstrated tremendous loyalty and bravery throughout his years with Jesus, volunteering to accompany his master back into dangerous territory where religious authorities had threatened his life, and Roman soldiers might arrest anyone associated with movement that could be interpreted as politically subversive or socially destabilizing, according to imperial standards that prioritized order over justice and stability over truth that might disturb comfortable arrangements between occupying forces and collaborative local authorities. His questions and uncertainties arose not from lack of love, but from desire to understand completely, to have solid foundations for faith that could withstand testing and persecution and inevitable challenges that would come to anyone who chose to follow Jesus in a world often hostile to divine love and suspicious of claims about eternal life and supernatural power that challenged assumptions upon which entire civilizations had been built through centuries of human effort and accumulated wisdom. Chapter 10: Opposition and Persecution. As Jesus' influence expanded throughout Palestine like ripples spreading across still water, reaching into every corner of Jewish society, where his teachings challenged assumptions that had been accepted without question for generations, and his presence inspired hope for changes that threatened established order, built upon carefully maintained balances of power and privilege. Religious and political authorities who benefited from existing arrangements began to recognize this carpenter from Nazareth not as welcome spiritual reformer whose message might strengthen their institutions and increase their influence, but as fundamental threat to systems through which they maintained control over populations, who had grown accustomed to looking to them for guidance about divine will and earthly responsibility. What had begun as curiosity about new teacher, whose methods differed from established rabbinical traditions and whose popularity among common people was creating excitement in communities that normally showed little enthusiasm for religious instruction, gradually hardened into skepticism about claims that seemed too extraordinary to accept without more evidence than miraculous healings could provide to minds trained in logical analysis and empirical verification. Then evolved into active opposition that sought to discredit his authority through public challenges designed to expose weaknesses in his theology or contradictions in his practices. The Pharisees, who had built their entire identity around meticulous observance of religious law that distinguished them from common people they considered less spiritually disciplined and theologically informed, found themselves increasingly disturbed by Jesus' apparent disregard for traditions they held sacred as essential expressions of covenant faithfulness that separated God's people from surrounding nations, whose moral standards and religious practices represented everything faithful Jews were supposed to reject as incompatible with divine revelation given through Moses and preserved through generations of careful study and punctilious application. When his disciples picked grain on Sabbath to satisfy hunger that made concentration difficult during long day of ministry that had begun before dawn and might not end until well after sunset, when he healed sick people on day designated for rest that was supposed to be kept holy through abstinence from work that included medical practice, according to interpretations developed by scholars who had spent years defining boundaries between necessary and unnecessary activities. When he ate meals with tax collectors and sinners without ensuring proper ceremonial cleansing had taken place according to regulations designed to prevent contamination through contact with those whose occupations or lifestyles had rendered them ritually impure, he was challenging not just their practices, but their fundamental understanding of what it meant to honor divine commandments. Their objections to Jesus' behavior were not merely petty criticisms of minor infractions or expressions of personal animosity toward someone whose popularity threatened their influence among populations they had previously controlled through careful maintenance of complex systems designed to regulate every aspect of spiritual life, but sincere expressions of concern about what they perceived as dangerous departures from scriptural authority and ancestral wisdom that had preserved Jewish identity through centuries of foreign occupation and cultural pressure to conform to Gentile customs that would eventually destroy everything that made them distinct as chosen people. They had dedicated their lives to learning complex requirements of religious law that governed every aspect of daily existence, from food preparation to business practices to social relationships, creating elaborate systems designed to help ordinary people avoid accidentally violating divine commandments whose transgression might result in spiritual contamination that would separate them from holy God, who could not tolerate sin in a form or degree. Their protective regulations around biblical precepts were intended to ensure that no faithful Jew could inadvertently step outside boundaries of acceptable behavior by creating buffer zones between clearly forbidden activities and potentially questionable practices. Jesus' casual attitude toward their protective traditions seemed to them like dangerous carelessness at best and blasphemous rebellion at worst, suggesting either ignorance of divine requirements that any properly educated teacher should understand, or deliberate contempt for authority structures that God Himself had established through Moses and maintained through legitimate religious leadership that bore responsibility for interpreting and applying eternal principles to contemporary situations. That required wisdom accumulated through centuries of study and discussion and practical experience with challenges that arose when idealistic theories encountered complex realities. His responses to their criticisms revealed hard issues behind their theological objections, exposing how easily religious devotion could become religious pride that valued system more than purpose it was meant to serve. How quickly concern for divine honor could transform into concern for personal reputation that depended upon being recognized as especially faithful by others, whose approval had become more important than divine approval that comes to those who understand that mercy triumphs over judgment and love fulfills law in ways that external compliance alone can never achieve. When He told them that Sabbath was made for humanity rather than humanity for Sabbath, He was turning their understanding of divine purpose upside down in ways that challenged everything they had been taught about proper priorities and spiritual values that should govern relationships between Creator and creation, between divine requirements and human needs, between eternal principles and temporal applications that must be flexible enough to serve love rather than rigid enough to crush spirits that divine law was meant to liberate from bondage to sin and fear and death. The Sadducees, who controlled temple operations and their lucrative financial arrangements while maintaining careful political relationships with Roman authorities that allowed them to preserve relative autonomy in religious matters as long as they prevented disturbances that might attract unwanted attention from imperial administrators who had little patience for local customs that seemed to interfere with efficient governance, saw Jesus primarily as threat to delicate balance they had achieved between spiritual responsibilities and political realities that required constant negotiation between competing demands of divine loyalty and earthly survival. Their opposition was motivated more by practical concerns about institutional preservation than by doctrinal disagreements about theological interpretations, though they certainly disagreed with many aspects of His teaching that seemed to undermine authority structures through which they exercised influence over populations whose religious activities generated revenue essential for maintaining temple services and supporting priestly families whose livelihood depended upon continued functioning of sacrificial system that Jesus appeared to be challenging through His emphasis on mercy rather than ritual, forgiveness rather than payment. They understood better than most how precarious their position had become under Roman rule that tolerated local religions only as long as they posed no threat to imperial interests or social stability that required cooperation from local leaders, who could be trusted to maintain order among populations that might otherwise require military intervention to prevent rebellion or civil disturbance that would be costly for Rome and catastrophic for Jewish people who had already suffered enormous losses during previous conflicts with occupying forces. The scribes and teachers of religious law, whose authority rested on their expertise in interpreting ancient texts and applying scriptural principles to contemporary situations that arose in communities struggling to maintain faith while accommodating political realities that often conflicted with religious ideals, found themselves intellectually threatened by someone who taught with direct authority rather than citing other authorities to support his positions, as was customary among rabbis who built their teachings on foundations laid by previous generations of scholars and interpreters whose accumulated wisdom formed tradition. Jesus didn't need to reference earlier rabbis or quote established commentaries to validate his teachings, because he spoke with immediacy of personal knowledge, revealing divine truth with clarity that made their elaborate, scholarly debates seem irrelevant and their careful academic distinctions appear insignificant compared to transforming power of simple truth spoken with authority that came from perfect relationship with Heavenly Father, whose will he knew intimately because he shared divine nature while fully experiencing human nature in perfect unity that enabled him to bridge gap between heaven and earth. Chapter 11. The final journey to Jerusalem. Time had come for Jesus to set his face with unwavering determination toward Jerusalem, and everyone who knew him could sense profound shift in his demeanor as he prepared for what he understood with divine clarity would be his final journey to Holy City, where prophets had always come to deliver their ultimate messages and often to die for truths that religious establishments found too threatening to tolerate. Where greatest demonstration of divine love in human history would soon unfold before a world that desperately needed to witness such complete self-sacrifice, offered freely for sake of human redemption. The relaxed pace that had characterized his Galilean ministry, with its gentle rhythms of teaching beside lake shores, where crowds gathered like families around beloved teacher whose words brought comfort to troubled hearts and hope to discouraged spirits, was drawing to its close as he gathered his disciples for pilgrimage that would transform everything they thought they understood about divine power and human salvation, about earthly kingdoms and heavenly purposes, about victory that looks like defeat and strength that expresses itself through weakness that confounds human wisdom. His closest followers, men who had walked with him through countless villages where his presence had brought healing and restoration to lives broken by disease and sin and despair that had seemed permanent until divine love proved stronger than every force that opposes human flourishing, recognized that something fundamental had changed in their master's attitude and approach to ministry that had previously seemed like pleasant journey through countryside filled with opportunities to demonstrate God's goodness to people who needed evidence that they were loved. There was new intensity in his prayers that lasted longer and seemed to penetrate depths they could not fathom. Deeper urgency in his teaching that pressed against hearts with weight of eternity, concentrated into words that would have to sustain his followers through trials they could not yet imagine. Quality of purposeful determination that seemed to pull him toward Jerusalem despite obvious dangers that awaited him there like storm clouds gathering on horizon that everyone could see, but no one could prevent. The religious authorities had already made their hostility clear through series of confrontations that revealed growing determination to eliminate this teacher, whose influence threatened their carefully constructed systems of control over populations who were beginning to question whether their traditional leaders truly represented divine will or merely human ambition, clothed in religious language that made self-interest sound like spiritual devotion. The political climate was charged with tensions that could explode into violence at any moment, as Passover season always brought increased Roman military presence to Jerusalem, where thousands of pilgrims gathered to commemorate liberation from Egyptian bondage while living under different but equally oppressive foreign occupation. Yet Jesus moved towards center of this danger with steady resolve of someone who knew exactly what he was walking into and why such apparent foolishness was actually wisest course of action possible for one whose mission required him to experience everything human existence could offer, including its worst manifestations of hatred and injustice and cruelty that would test divine Love to its absolute limits while providing opportunity for that love to demonstrate its unconquerable nature through response that would astonish angels and confound demons. The disciples followed with growing uneasiness that mixed excitement about accompanying their master to Holy City during most important religious celebration of Jewish year, with increasing anxiety about what such journey might cost them personally in terms of safety and security they had found in relatively peaceful ministry among villages of Galilee, where people generally received them with gratitude rather than hostility, with openness rather than suspicion that characterized atmosphere in Judea, where religious opposition was more organized and political sensitivity was heightened. Some walked close behind Jesus, trying to catch fragments of his prayers as he communed with Heavenly Father about mission that was reaching its climactic moment when all accumulated sin and suffering of humanity would be concentrated into experience so terrible that even divine strength would be tested to its limits. Their hearts troubled by words they occasionally overheard about suffering and death that made no sense in context of kingdom they had been expecting him to establish through demonstrations of irresistible power. Others hung back in group, whispering among themselves about wisdom of this journey that seemed like march toward certain disaster, wondering whether following Jesus to Jerusalem might be final mistake that would cost them everything they held dear, including their lives and futures and families, who depended on them for support and protection in a world where being associated with condemned criminal could bring persecution and suffering upon everyone connected to his movement, whether they had participated in whatever crimes might be charged against their leader. Word of Jesus' approach spread ahead of them like wildfire racing across dry grassland, reaching villages and towns along their route where people came out to see this teacher, whose reputation had traveled throughout Palestine and beyond its borders into regions where stories of his miraculous healings and revolutionary teachings had created expectations that varied dramatically depending on what hearers hoped to find in someone who claimed authority over life and death, sickness and health, sign and forgiveness. Some came seeking healing for themselves or their loved ones, carrying sick children or elderly parents or disabled relatives who represented last hope for families that had exhausted every other resource in search of relief from conditions that had resisted all conventional treatments while consuming financial reserves and emotional strength that had once seemed adequate for normal challenges, but proved insufficient when confronted with extraordinary needs that required extraordinary intervention. Others were simply curious about man who had become subject of so much discussion and debate among religious leaders, who could not agree about his identity or significance, whose teachings seemed to contradict established interpretations of scriptural prophecy, while fulfilling expectations in ways that traditional messianic theories had not anticipated, whose methods of ministry challenged institutional authorities while demonstrating power that validated claims no mere human being should have been able to make. Many joined growing procession spontaneously, sensing that they were witnessing something historic that would be remembered and recounted for generations to come by those whose lives had been touched by encounter with divine love, walking among mortals in mortal form, participating in events that would mark decisive turning point in human history when eternal purposes intersected with temporal circumstances to produce outcomes that would affect every soul that would ever draw breath upon earth. As they approached Jerusalem, Jesus made arrangements to visit Bethany, small village where his close friends Mary, Martha, and Lazarus had welcomed him many times before, providing place of refuge and authentic fellowship that offered respite from demands of public ministry that never allowed complete privacy or total relaxation from responsibilities that weighed heavily on his human heart, even as his divine nature remained perfectly at peace with Father's will and eternal purposes that would be accomplished regardless of human opposition. But this visit would involve more than rest and refreshment, becoming instead stage for most dramatic miracle of his entire earthly ministry, raising of Lazarus from dead after 4 days in tomb, demonstration of power over death itself that would send shockwaves throughout region and provide final evidence of his divine nature that would either convince honest seekers or harden opposition of those whose hearts had already been closed to truth. No amount of evidence could penetrate because they had chosen darkness over light. When Jesus finally arrived in Bethany, he found household in mourning, with Martha and Mary grieving loss of their beloved brother and wondering why Jesus had not come sooner, why he had allowed someone he loved to die when his presence could have prevented such tragedy that had plunged their family into sorrow and their community into sympathy for loss that seemed so unnecessary and premature to human understanding that could not see larger picture or comprehend ways that even death serves purposes of love. Their questions revealed kind of honest wrestling with divine purposes that characterizes authentic faith. Struggle to understand how divine love can coexist with human suffering, how divine power can permit losses that seem preventable and unnecessary, to human understanding that cannot see larger picture or comprehend ways that even death serves purposes of love that transcends earthly life and temporal relationships that matter deeply but are not. Final word about meaning and purpose. Chapter 12, The Last Supper and Betrayal. An upper room that had been carefully prepared according to specific instructions that revealed Jesus' supernatural knowledge of events about to unfold, and his divine control over circumstances that seemed to be spiraling toward catastrophe, but were actually proceeding according to eternal plan that would accomplish salvation through means that appeared to guarantee destruction. As shadows lengthened over Jerusalem and golden light of oil lamps began to flicker against stone walls that would witness most intimate and heartbreaking scene in all of human history, Jesus gathered with his 12 chosen companions for what he knew with terrible certainty would be their final meal together before everything they had shared would be shattered. The Passover celebration that spread before them on low table, around which they reclined according to custom for festive meals that commemorated freedom from bondage, carried accumulated weight of centuries of tradition, each ritual element connecting them to their ancestors' experience of divine deliverance from slavery in Egypt, through miraculous intervention that demonstrated God's power over oppressive forces and his willingness to rescue his people when their situation seemed hopeless. Each prayer and symbolic food reminding them of divine faithfulness to covenant promises that had sustained Jewish identity through generations of wandering and waiting. Tonight, these ancient symbols would be invested with entirely new meaning as Jesus transformed this memorial of past deliverance into foundation of future salvation that would extend beyond ethnic boundaries to embrace all humanity in scope of divine love that knew no limits based on race or culture or social status or moral performance that typically determined who was considered worthy of divine favor according to human standards that reflected pride more than grace, exclusion more than inclusion, judgment more than mercy. As they shared intimate fellowship that had sustained them through years of ministry together, traveling from village to village where Jesus' teaching and healing had transformed countless lives while gradually building opposition from religious authorities who felt threatened by his influence. Over populations they had previously controlled through careful maintenance of complex systems designed to regulate every aspect of spiritual life, there was atmosphere of both celebration and underlying tension that none of them could quite identify or explain. Jesus seemed simultaneously peaceful and deeply moved, speaking with intensity that suggested these words carried eternal significance while displaying tenderness that revealed his infinite love for these imperfect men who had walked with him through miracles and controversies, triumphs that had lifted their spirits and disappointments that had tested their faith. Moments of clarity when divine purposes seemed obvious, and periods of confusion when nothing made sense except their commitment to follow wherever he might lead them. I have eagerly desired to eat this Passover with you before I suffer, he told them with voice that carried both anticipation of what was to come and sorrow for what it would mean for those he loved more than his own life, whose welfare concerned him more than his own safety. whose future troubled him more than his own fate that had been determined before foundation of world was laid, and time began its march toward moment when eternity would invade history through sacrifice that would appear to many like defeat, but would actually represent ultimate victory. For I tell you, he continued with authority that came from perfect knowledge of divine plans that human minds could not grasp in their entirety, but could trust in their goodness because they originated in heart of infinite love. I will not eat it again until it finds fulfillment in kingdom of God. Words that hung in air like prophecy they could not decipher. Promise wrapped in mystery that would only become clear through devastating and glorious events of next days that would challenge everything they thought they understood about power and weakness. Before they began formal meal with its prescribed rituals and familiar prayers that connected every Jewish family to shared history of divine deliverance and ongoing hope for ultimate restoration of all things according to divine purposes that transcended individual understanding but could be trusted. Because they flowed from wisdom and love that never failed those who committed their lives to divine will, Jesus rose from his place at table and did something so shocking that it reduced his disciples to stunned silence. He removed his outer garments with deliberate care that suggested profound significance in every action, wrapped towel around his waist like common servant preparing for menial labor, poured water into basin that would normally be used by household slaves for washing feet of guests, whose sandaled journey through dusty streets had left them in need of cleansing before they could properly participate in sacred meal, and began to perform work that even servants often tried to avoid because it placed them in position of such humiliation. Peter's protest was immediate and vehement, his voice expressing shock and embarrassment that they all felt at witnessing such divine humility, such complete reversal of every normal understanding of authority and respect that governed relationships between teachers and students, masters and disciples, leaders and followers who were supposed to serve rather than be served by those whose superior wisdom and spiritual development entitled them to honor rather than requiring them to humble themselves. "Lord, are you going to wash my feet?" he asked with incredulity that revealed how completely this act of service contradicted everything he had been taught about proper relationships between people of different ranks and responsibilities. Question that carried undertones of protest against violation of order that seemed essential for maintaining respect and authority that would be undermined if leaders descended to level of servants, and servants were elevated to position of masters. When Jesus gently insisted that Peter could not understand significance of what was happening until later when events would illuminate truths that were hidden in present darkness, but would become clear in light of resurrection that would transform their understanding of everything they had witnessed during their years with him, Peter's response was characteristically absolute in its swing from one extreme to another, without finding middle ground that might have been more appropriate. "No," Peter declared with finality that revealed his genuine horror at thought of allowing his master to serve him in such humble capacity. "You shall never wash my feet." But when Jesus explained that unless he performed this service, Peter would have no part with him, impulsive fisherman immediately reversed his position with typical excess that showed his heart was in right place, even when his understanding was incomplete and his reactions were driven more by emotion than wisdom. "Then, Lord," Peter exclaimed with enthusiasm that missed point entirely, "not just my feet but my hands and my head as well," demonstrating once again his tendency toward extremes that would need to be tempered by experience and matured by divine grace, working through successes and failures that would teach him balance between zeal and wisdom, passion and prudence, love and understanding that grows through relationship rather than instruction. After Jesus had finished washing their feet and returned to his place at table, he began speaking words that would be treasured and pondered by every generation of believers until he comes again to establish fully kingdom he was now inaugurating through his life and approaching death and resurrection that would validate every claim he had made about his identity and mission and relationship with Father, who sent him to seek and save lost sheep. As they shared Passover meal with its traditional elements and familiar prayers, connecting them to their ancestors' experience of divine deliverance from slavery in Egypt, Jesus took unleavened bread that commemorated their forefathers' hasty departure from bondage and invested it with meaning that would echo through eternity as symbol of his body given for redemption of humanity, enslaved to sin and death and separation from God who created them for fellowship. "Take and eat," he said, breaking bread and distributing it among disciples who received these familiar elements with growing awareness that something unprecedented was happening. "This is my body given for you. Do this in remembrance of me." Simple act of sharing food became profound symbol of divine love, poured out completely for human salvation, transforming ordinary meal into sacred covenant that would bind believers to their Savior and to one another across centuries. Similarly, cup of wine that traditionally represented joy and divine blessing became symbol of new covenant, sealed not with blood of sacrificial animals but with Jesus' own life poured out for forgiveness of sins that separate human hearts from holy God, who desires relationship but cannot compromise his perfect righteousness by ignoring rebellion that must be dealt with according to divine justice, tempered by infinite mercy expressed through substitutionary sacrifice. "This cup is new covenant in my blood," he told them as they shared wine that would forever after remind his followers of price paid for their redemption, which is poured out for you and for many for forgiveness of sins. The disciples received these elements with reverence, though they could not yet grasp full significance of what Jesus was telling them, could not comprehend that they were participating in inauguration of relationship between God and humanity that would last forever. But then atmosphere in room shifted dramatically as Jesus made announcement that sent shock waves through their intimate fellowship, words that fell like stones into peaceful gathering and created ripples of confusion and distress that reached every heart around table, where love had been celebrated and covenant established. "One of you will betray me," he declared, and they began asking one by one whether surely he didn't mean them, their voices revealing genuine bewilderment at possibility that anyone among their number could be capable of such treachery. Chapter 13. The Cross and the Crown. From peaceful intimacy of upper room, where love had been demonstrated through service and covenant had been established through shared bread and wine, Jesus led his disciples through sleeping streets of Jerusalem toward garden called Gethsemane, place of ancient olive trees where he had often retreated for prayer and communion with Heavenly Father, whose will he had come to accomplish regardless of personal cost, but which tonight would become arena for most intense spiritual battle ever fought on earth, as divine love prepared to embrace human suffering in ways that would test even divine strength to its absolute limits while revealing perfect harmony between justice and mercy. The garden that had been sanctuary of peace during their previous visits, where solitude and natural beauty had provided perfect environment for contemplation and worship that refreshed his human spirit while strengthening his resolve to complete mission that had brought him from heavenly glory to earthly sorrow, felt different this night as they passed beneath branches heavy with leaves that rustled in evening breeze, like whispered prayers ascending toward stars that had witnessed countless human struggles but none comparable to cosmic conflict about to unfold. Atmosphere was charged with sense of impending crisis that even disciples could sense despite their incomplete understanding of what was approaching with each passing hour that brought them closer to events that would transform their understanding of everything they thought they knew about divine power and human salvation, about earthly kingdoms and heavenly purposes, about victory that appears as defeat and strength that expresses itself through weakness that confounds worldly wisdom while revealing divine love in its purest form. Jesus' demeanor had changed from tender intimacy they had experienced during their final meal together to something heavier, more burdened by weight of divine mission as it reached climactic moment when all accumulated sin and suffering of humanity would be concentrated into single experience of separation from Father's love that would be more agonizing than any physical torture human cruelty could devise. More devastating than death itself, because it would involve spiritual anguish that perfect holiness experiences when it comes into contact with moral corruption. "My soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to point of death," he told Peter, James, and John, 3 disciples he had chosen to accompany him deeper into garden, while others waited at entrance, where they could watch for approaching danger that he knew was coming, but which they hoped might somehow be avoided if they remained vigilant and prepared to defend their master against enemies who sought his destruction through means that would appear to triumph but would actually accomplish opposite of their intentions. His words revealed profound humanity of one who was fully divine, showing that incarnation meant experiencing complete range of human emotion, including anguish so intense it threatened to crush even divine strength. Revealing that salvation would be accomplished not through divine power that bypassed human suffering, but through divine love that entered fully into human experience, including its darkest moments when hope seems extinguished and faith appears foolish. "Stay here and keep watch with me," he requested with voice that carried both authority of divine command and vulnerability of human need for companionship. During hour when isolation would make agony even more unbearable, when loneliness would compound physical and spiritual torment into combination of sufferings that no human being had ever endured or ever could endure, except for one whose perfect innocence made him capable of bearing guilt he had never earned. Moving beyond even these closest companions whose presence provided some comfort, but could not share burden that was his alone to carry, Jesus fell face down on ground that received his prostrate form like altar prepared for sacrifice that would surpass every offering ever made in human history. His face pressed against earth that would soon drink his blood, while his heart broke under pressure of divine wrath against sin that he had never committed, but was willingly accepting. "My Father," he prayed with voice that carried agony no human throat had ever expressed. Words torn from depths of divine nature wrestling with human nature in perfect unity, yet perfect tension, as 2 aspects of his being confronted reality of what perfect love was willing to endure for sake of imperfect creatures, who deserved judgment but would receive mercy through substitute, who would experience their condemnation. "If it is possible, may this cup be taken from me." The cup he referenced in prayer that penetrated heavens and moved heart of eternal Father, whose love for his Son was matched only by his love for lost humanity that required this terrible sacrifice, was not merely physical death that would end his earthly ministry in pain and humiliation, but spiritual agony of bearing humanity's sin in his own person, experiencing separation from divine love that sin creates, drinking full measure of divine wrath against human rebellion while maintaining perfect love for those whose rebellion he was taking upon himself. Yet even in this moment of ultimate testing, when human nature recoiled from suffering that lay ahead, and divine nature grieved over necessity that made such suffering unavoidable, if love was to triumph over justice without compromising either attribute of divine character, Jesus concluded his prayer with words that secured redemption of everyone who would ever believe in him as substitute for their sins and source of their righteousness before God, who accepts Christ's perfect obedience in place of their disobedience. "Not as I will, but as you will," he surrendered with submission that revealed perfect harmony between Father and Son, even in a moment when that harmony would be temporarily broken by sin-bearing that would separate them in ways that had never occurred in eternity past and would never occur again in eternity future, making this moment unique in divine experience as love embraced suffering for sake of creatures who could never repay debt they owed. 3 times he prayed this prayer of ultimate surrender, and 3 times he returned to find his disciples sleeping, despite his request that they keep watch with him during hour of greatest need, when human companionship might have provided some small comfort to ease isolation that made spiritual agony even more unbearable. Their failure revealed human inability to comprehend or participate in depths of what divine love was willing to endure for their salvation. their weakness that contrasted sharply with his strength. As Jesus emerged from his final time of prayer, face radiant with peace that comes from complete surrender to divine will despite costs such surrender would require. Strengthened by angelic ministry that had been sent from heaven to prepare him for ordeal ahead, while confirming Father's approval of Son's willingness to drink cup that had been prepared for him before foundation of world was laid. Sound of approaching footsteps and flickering torches broke garden's sacred silence. Judas arrived leading crowd of soldiers and temple guards, armed with swords and clubs, as if they were arresting dangerous criminal, whose followers might attempt violent resistance, rather than teacher whose only weapons had been words of love and acts of compassion that had brought healing to thousands and hope to countless others who had discovered, in his presence, what divine love looked like when it walked among mortals. The betrayal was accomplished through kiss, traditional greeting between rabbi and disciple perverted into signal for arrest, intimacy weaponized for treachery. Yet even in this moment of ultimate rejection by one of his chosen companions, Jesus called Judas friend and asked why he had come, extending grace to very one who was delivering him to his enemies, offering love even to heart that had chosen material reward over spiritual relationship. Demonstrating mercy toward one whose betrayal would accomplish divine purposes, while destroying betrayer's soul through guilt that no amount of silver could ease. The trials that followed were travesties of justice from beginning to end, conducted by religious leaders who had already decided on their verdict and were merely seeking legal justification for predetermined conclusion that would eliminate threat Jesus posed to their authority over populations who were beginning to question whether traditional leadership truly represented divine will or merely human ambition disguised as spiritual devotion. Chapter 14. The promise fulfilled in profound silence that followed Jesus' death. Silence broken only by weeping of women who had loved him and awed whispers of witnesses who recognized they had observed something unprecedented in human experience, something that challenged every assumption about power and weakness, victory and defeat. Life and death that governed human understanding of how divine purposes operate in a world that often seems abandoned by any benevolent force capable of intervening on behalf of those who suffer through no fault of their own. Very fabric of creation seemed to hold its breath as earth and heaven processed completion of most significant event in human history. The Roman centurion who had supervised countless executions during his military career, professional soldier accustomed to witnessing death in its most brutal forms, without allowing emotion to interfere with duty, that required him to maintain order among crowds that gathered to watch public punishment designed to deter crime, through display of consequences that awaited those who challenged imperial authority or violated laws that maintained peace, essential for commerce and governance, found himself compelled to acknowledge what he had observed during these hours when darkness covered earth and temple veil was torn and rocks split as if nature itself was responding to event that transcended natural categories. Surely this was righteous man, he declared with conviction that surprised him because it emerged from depths of his being, where truth resided despite years of training, designed to suppress such responses in favor of professional detachment that allowed soldiers to perform their duties without being paralyzed by moral qualms or emotional reactions that might interfere with effectiveness required for maintaining imperial order through force when necessary and fear when force was not immediately available. According to some accounts that circulated among early believers whose testimonies were carefully preserved by those who recognized their historical significance, the centurion went even further in his acknowledgement of what he had witnessed, declaring with authority, earned through years of observing human behavior under extreme stress, that revealed true character when all pretense was stripped away. Truly this man was Son of God. Words that carried weight because they came from someone who had no religious or political motivation to make such statement, but was simply reporting what his trained eye had observed. As evening approached and Sabbath drew near according to Jewish reckoning, that began new day at sunset rather than sunrise, creating urgency for proper burial procedures that had to be completed before Holy Day, commenced with its restrictions on work that included handling dead bodies. Joseph of Arimathea, wealthy member of ruling council who had been secret follower of Jesus throughout his ministry but had lacked courage to publicly identify himself with teacher whose popularity among common people was matched by hostility from religious authorities, finally found strength to act according to his convictions. This was a moment that required him to choose between safety that came from remaining hidden among those who opposed Jesus and integrity that demanded he honor in death the one he had followed in secret during life. Between preserving his position and reputation among colleagues who had condemned Jesus as blasphemer, deserving death, and acknowledging publicly his belief that this condemnation had been unjust. Between maintaining comfortable anonymity and accepting risks that came with open discipleship that might cost him everything he had worked lifetime to achieve. His request to Pilate for permission to bury Jesus' body properly, rather than allowing it to be thrown into common grave reserved for executed criminals whose families could not afford private burial or whose crimes had made them outcasts even in death, was act of considerable bravery that publicly identified him with condemned man and could have resulted in loss of his position on ruling council, damage to his reputation that might affect his business relationships, possibly even criminal charges if authorities decided his request indicated seditious sympathies. But love compelled him to ensure that Jesus received honorable burial, befitting his true identity as Son of God, whose death had accomplished salvation for all who would believe, rather than disgraceful disposal that would add final insult to injuries he had suffered during crucifixion that had been designed not merely to kill, but to humiliate, to break spirit as well as body, to serve as public deterrent that would discourage others from challenging authority that possessed power to inflict such terrible punishment. Together with Nicodemus, another member of religious establishment who had first come to Jesus under cover of darkness to avoid being seen by colleagues who would have questioned his interest in teacher, whose methods challenged their authority and whose message threatened their comfortable assumptions about divine approval based on external performance. Rather than heart transformation, Joseph carefully removed Jesus' body from cross that had become altar where perfect sacrifice was offered for imperfect humanity. They wrapped body in linen cloths with expensive spices that cost them considerable sum, but represented investment in hope that death was not final word in story of one who had claimed power over life and death, who had promised resurrection that seemed impossible according to natural laws, but might be possible according to supernatural power that had demonstrated itself through miracles they had witnessed during his ministry among people who had experienced healing and restoration that defied medical explanation. The tomb where they laid Jesus' body was new one that Joseph had prepared for his own eventual use, carved from solid rock in garden near place of crucifixion, sealed with massive stone that would require several strong men to move under normal circumstances, guarded by Roman soldiers who had been posted there at request of religious authorities who remembered his predictions about rising from dead on third day and wanted to prevent disciples from stealing body and claiming resurrection have occurred. The women who had followed Jesus from Galilee, watching from distance as he died while noting carefully where his body was laid so they could return after Sabbath to complete burial preparations that had been performed hastily due to time constraints imposed by approaching Holy Day observances, planned to honor him with final act of devotion that their love made necessary even though their hearts were breaking with grief that seemed unbearable and their faith was shattered by apparent failure of everything they had believed. The Sabbath passed in crushing sorrow for Jesus' followers who huddled together behind locked doors, overwhelmed by grief and confusion that made them question everything they thought they understood about divine purposes and human destiny, struggling to process apparent collapse of dreams that had sustained them through years of following one who had seemed to possess power over every force that oppressed and destroyed human happiness, but had somehow been defeated by very forces he had challenged most directly. But while they mourned what appeared to be ultimate victory of hatred over love, death over life, despair over hope that had seemed so bright and beautiful during days when Jesus had walked among them, bringing healing to sick and comfort to mourning, and good news to poor who had been forgotten by everyone else but were remembered by divine love that noticed every need and responded to every cry for help. Something unprecedented was stirring in tomb where his body had been laid, something that would transform their grief into joy. Early on first day of week, before dawn had fully broken over Jerusalem still sleeping in aftermath of Passover, celebration that had been overshadowed by execution that had shocked even those who had demanded it, Mary Magdalene made her way to tomb carrying spices to anoint Jesus' body. Her heart heavy with sorrow, but her devotion compelling her to perform final act of service for one who had transformed her life by freeing her from demons that had tormented her and giving her purpose and identity and hope. When she arrived at Garden Tomb, she discovered something that challenged every assumption about permanence of death and finality of separation that death creates between those who remain and those who depart, something that would transform her grief into joy, her despair into hope, her questions into certainty about divine love's ultimate victory over every force that opposes human flourishing and divine purposes that will not be defeated by temporary appearances of failure. The massive stone that had sealed entrance was rolled away, not from outside as if someone had broken into steel body, but from inside as if someone had broken out, lying at angle that suggested it had been moved not by human strength but by supernatural force that made its weight irrelevant to purposes that operated according to principles that transcended physical laws and human limitations that govern ordinary existence but prove inadequate when divine power intervenes. Angels whose very presence transformed tomb into sanctuary of divine glory greeted her bewilderment with words that would echo through eternity, bringing hope to every heart that has ever been broken by loss and every soul that has ever wondered whether love is strong enough to overcome death and separation and all forces that threaten to destroy what God has created and called good, despite its current brokenness and need for redemption. "Why do you look for living among dead?" they asked with voices that carried music of heaven into earthly sorrow that had seemed final and irreversible. "He is not here. He has risen, just as he said." Their invitation to come and see place where he lay became invitation to witness evidence that death had been conquered, grave had been robbed of its victory. Hope was not only restored, but vindicated in most wonderful way imaginable. When Mary ran to tell disciples what she had found, her words tumbled over each other in excitement and confusion as she struggled to communicate experience that transcended ordinary language and challenged fundamental assumptions about nature of reality and boundaries between possible and impossible that human reason had established through centuries of observation and analysis that suddenly seemed inadequate to explain what she had witnessed with her own eyes. Peter and John raced to tomb to verify her report, their hearts pounding with mixture of hope and disbelief as their feet carried them toward evidence that would either confirm their worst fears or exceed their wildest dreams about what divine love might accomplish through apparent defeat that could actually be victory, disguised in form that human wisdom could not recognize until divine revelation illuminated its true significance. John arrived first but waited for Peter at entrance, and Peter characteristically rushed inside to examine evidence firsthand. Seeing linen cloths lying undisturbed and face cloth folded neatly by itself, everything arranged with care that suggested purposeful departure rather than hasty theft or violent disturbance by grave robbers, who would have been interested only in valuables rather than careful preservation of burial materials that held no monetary value. John followed Peter into empty tomb and saw same evidence, but his response was different because his heart was prepared by love to recognize what his eyes were showing him. He saw and believed. Careful arrangement of grave clothes, obvious absence of body, supernatural nature of what had occurred all combined to convince John that Jesus had indeed risen from dead, that death had been conquered by divine love, that hope was not only restored, but vindicated. Later that same day, Jesus appeared to Mary Magdalene as she wept outside tomb. Speaking her name in familiar voice, she had learned to love and follow, revealing himself as alive and victorious over death itself. Her joy at recognizing him was tempered only by his instruction not to cling to him, as he had not yet ascended to Father, but to go and tell disciples that he was alive, and that their relationship with divine love had been transformed through his sacrifice and resurrection. That evening, as disciples gathered behind locked doors, paralyzed by fear of what religious authorities might do to them now that their master was gone, Jesus appeared among them with words that transformed their terror into overwhelming joy, greeting them with peace and showing them his hands and side, proving his identity through wounds of crucifixion, while demonstrating that his resurrection was complete restoration to life. Not mere spiritual survival, but bodily triumph over death itself, that validated every promise he had made. Chapter 15. Until we meet again in peace. Here at gentle conclusion of our sacred journey together, through life and love of Jesus Christ. As peaceful darkness of night settles around, you like most comforting embrace that speaks of divine care for every detail of your existence. And your breathing naturally deepens into rhythm of blessed rest that comes from knowing you are held by arms that will never grow weary of carrying you through every trial and every joy that awaits you in days ahead. I want to pause with you in profound gratitude for these precious hours we have shared, walking together through most beautiful and transformative story ever told. We began this evening with you carrying whatever burdens today had placed upon your shoulders, perhaps feeling overwhelmed by responsibilities that seemed to multiply faster than your strength to meet them, possibly questioning your worth or wondering if there truly existed love in this universe that knew your name and cared about your deepest needs and longest struggles that sometimes feel too heavy for human heart to bear without breaking under weight of disappointment and discouragement that accumulates like dust on traveler's cloak. We conclude with you resting securely in embrace of that very love we have encountered together, surrounded by truth that you have never been alone and never could be alone, because you are cherished beyond your ability to comprehend by one who spoke galaxies into existence, yet pays attention to every whispered prayer and silent longing of your heart that may feel insignificant when compared to cosmic forces and global events, but matters infinitely too. Divine love that measures significance not by size but by depth of care invested. The Jesus we have met together in these quiet hours is not merely figure from ancient history, confined to pages of old books or memories of civilizations that have crumbled into dust, but living presence who reaches across every barrier of time and space to touch tired hearts exactly like yours, to offer rest to weary souls exactly like yours, to extend forgiveness and acceptance to imperfect people exactly like you and me, who need grace more than we need anything else this world could offer. His love transcends historical boundaries and cultural limitations to meet you in your present circumstances with same tenderness that characterized his interactions with disciples who disappointed him, and crowds who misunderstood him, and enemies who betrayed him, yet never exhausted his capacity for forgiveness or diminished his commitment to their welfare despite their treatment of him during years when he walked among them, demonstrating what divine love looks like when it takes human form. The cross we witnessed together was not simply tragic end to beautiful life cut short by human jealousy and religious pride that could not tolerate challenge to established authority and institutional power that served human interests more than divine purposes, but ultimate demonstration of divine love, willing to pay any price for human redemption. Definitive proof that there is no depth of human need that divine grace cannot reach, no darkness so profound that divine light cannot penetrate it. The resurrection we celebrated together revealed that this love is not merely beautiful sentiment that comforts grieving hearts, but has no power to change actual circumstances. Not wishful thinking that helps people cope with harsh realities, but offers no genuine hope for transformation. Not temporary comfort that makes suffering bearable for a moment, but provides no lasting solution to problems that plague human existence. But victorious power that conquers every enemy of human happiness and divine purpose. If this sacred journey has brought even a moment of genuine peace to your troubled heart, that has been carrying anxiety and worry like stones in pocket that grow heavier with each passing day, if these ancient stories have awakened something beautiful in your spirit that had been sleeping under weight of disappointment and discouragement that accumulated through experiences of broken promises and failed relationships and dreams that died slow deaths, if you have found yourself breathing more freely or feeling more connected to love that holds universe together, then you have discovered treasure worth guarding. This treasure is meant to be shared with others who are walking same pathways of seeking and struggling that you have walked, who are carrying same burdens of loneliness and fear and confusion that you have carried, who are asking same questions about meaning and purpose and hope that you have asked during seasons when life seemed empty of divine presence and barren of divine purpose that could make suffering meaningful and struggles worthwhile. This community of fellow seekers that has formed around these contemplative stories represents something precious and rare in our modern world that often seems designed to fragment attention and fracture peace that souls desperately need for spiritual health, that enables physical health and emotional health and relational health, that makes life worth living rather than mere survival from one disappointing day to another, hoping for better tomorrow that may never come. By joining our family through subscription to continued journey together, by participating in conversations that form when hearts risk vulnerability and share honestly about their spiritual experiences and discoveries, you become part of something that transcends mere content consumption too. Become fellowship with people who understand that slowing down reveals more truth than speeding up toward destinations that may not be worth reaching, if process destroys souls created for joy. Your voice matters tremendously in sacred conversation we maintain together across continents and cultures. Your reflections and experiences adding unique threads to tapestry of testimony that encourages every heart that encounters it to believe in possibilities for transformation and healing that divine love makes available to anyone whose heart remains open to receiving what pride would reject and fear would refuse, and cynicism would dismiss as too good to be true. Please know that your thoughts about this journey we have shared together tonight, whatever particular moments in Jesus' story have spoken most directly to your own need for hope or healing or forgiveness, or simply assurance that you matter to someone whose love never fails, are deeply valued and warmly welcomed in comments where hearts can share honestly about their spiritual journeys without fear of judgment. Your questions reveal seeking heart, and seeking hearts are exactly what divine love delights to find and satisfy with truth that brings both comfort for present struggles and hope for future possibilities that seem impossible according to human limitations, but become possible through divine power working in cooperation with human faith that trusts completely even when understanding remains incomplete and circumstances suggest reasons for doubt. Your struggles connect you to universal human experience of wrestling with doubt and disappointment that has characterized every generation since paradise was lost and people began wondering whether it could ever be regained through anything other than divine intervention that comes as gift rather than reward earned through religious performance or moral achievement that always falls short of perfect righteousness required for fellowship with perfectly holy God. In weeks and months ahead, we will continue exploring stories that possess power to heal wounded hearts and restore hope to discouraged spirits, journeying together through experiences of saints and mystics who discovered divine presence in desert solitudes and mountain retreats where silence taught them truths that noise obscures and solitude revealed relationships that crowds complicate, learning how their encounters with divine love can illuminate our own spiritual paths. Each story we explore together will be crafted with same loving care as tonight's journey, designed to help you transition from whatever anxieties have marked your day to blessing of peaceful rest that comes from knowing you are completely loved by someone whose love never changes regardless of how circumstances change. Always intended to remind you that you are precious beyond your ability to comprehend and valuable beyond any price that could be paid, except the price that was paid. Feel now how your body has naturally released every remaining tension that was holding muscles tight and nerves on edge. How your breathing has slowed to gentle rhythm of someone who knows they are safe in presence of love that never sleeps or slumbers, but watches over you with care, that notices every detail of your existence and responds to every need before you are even aware that need exists. As sleep begins to claim your consciousness, carrying you from wakefulness into blessed unconsciousness, where divine love continues its healing work in regions of your soul too deep for conscious awareness to reach, but not too deep for divine grace to penetrate, with restoration that happens during rest when defenses are lowered and hearts are open to receive gifts they might refuse during waking hours. Let your final conscious thoughts be filled with gratitude for love you have encountered tonight. You are falling asleep tonight, not merely into natural rest that restores physical energy, but into everlasting arms that have held every believer who has ever found peace in divine love, every heart that has ever been healed by divine grace, every soul that has ever discovered their true identity as beloved child of God, who created them for relationship with Himself and destines them for eternal joy. In His presence, where every tear will be wiped away. Sweet dreams, precious child of divine love, knowing you are beloved beyond your ability to understand, accepted beyond your ability to earn, held by love stronger than death and more enduring than time itself, that will never let you go, regardless of what storms may come, or what challenges may test your faith, or what changes may occur in external circumstances that cannot touch eternal relationship you have with one who knew you before you were born. Until we meet again in this sacred space where weary hearts find rest and searching souls discover home they have always been seeking, may you know beyond any doubt that you are treasured, you are valued, you are exactly who divine love created you to be, and you are destined for more beauty and joy and purpose than your heart can currently imagine, but will experience fully when perfect love casts out all fear and perfect peace surpasses all understanding. Rest now in perfect peace, surrounded by perfect love, held by perfect grace that covers every imperfection and transforms every weakness into strength, every failure into learning, every ending into new beginning, filled with possibilities as infinite as love that created you and will never stop believing in wonderful person you are becoming through divine transformation, working patiently in depths of your being until that day when faith becomes sight and hope becomes reality. Good night, dear one, and may divine love fill your dreams with visions of glory that awaits you. May angels watch over your sleep with protection that never fails. And may you awaken tomorrow refreshed not only in body, but renewed in spirit, ready for another day of walking in love that makes every ordinary moment sacred and every simple act of kindness participation in divine purposes that extend far beyond what eyes can see or minds can comprehend. Amen and amen, beloved friend. Sleep peacefully in arms of infinite love until we meet again.